Okay, the House Committee on Elections will please come to order, and clerk, please call the roll.
Chair Lovenberg.
Here.
Vice Chair Israel. Representative Anderson.
Here.
Representative Fallon. Chair Larson.
Here.
Representative Reynolds.
Present.
Representative Swanson.
Here.
Okay, a quorum is present, and we have a couple of housekeeping things we need to do. One, if anyone is here on House Bill 1887, Representative Romero has chosen to withdraw the bill, so there's no need to testify today. And it's at his request, so we're pulling that bill off the calendar. Secondly, I need to make a correction of the March 20th, 2017 public hearing minutes. So, having said that, the chair moves to correct the minutes for the meeting held on March 20th, 2017. And the correction, the summary of the correction was to reflect the suspension of the rules that I made on March 16, 2017, that added House Bill 1707 by Representative Swanson to the public hearing post for March 20th. So when I suspended the motion, I needed to acknowledge that at the committee meeting that we had when we added the bill. So it's a technicality that I need to correct, and so is there any objection? And hearing none, then I move to correct the minutes, and so it is ordered. Okay. Now, having said that, Chair calls up, or Chair lays out House Bill 3648 for consideration and recognizes Representative Goldman, Vice Chair, to explain your bill.
Thank you, Madam Chair and fellow members. Currently, the Election Code of Texas allows for a United States passport to be used as an acceptable form of photo identification. The Secretary of State recognizes a passport card that is issued by the U.S. Department of State as a valid voter ID, but it's not clarified in statute. House Bill 3648 adds necessary clarification in statute that both a U.S. passport book and a card are acceptable forms of voter ID in Texas.
Okay, and Chair would like to recognize Vice Chair Israel as present, and Chair recognizes Representative Fallon as present. Okay. Members, are there any questions? And
I reserve the right to close.
all right, so the Chair calls up Bill Fairbrother. Oh, and before you get started, Bill, again, I just want to make the announcement to everyone. If you want to testify on the bill, please register with our clerk if you haven't already done so. Please be sure when you come up to testify to state your name, who you represent, and your position on the bill. Hang on a second, Bill. And as you will see, we are now in the crunch period, and you're going to see members coming and going, laying out bills. So don't be offended. They'll be back, and, it's not because they're not interested. Believe me, they're interested. But they have lots of bills that they're laying out. So with that,
interested in all the comments.
Representative Chair Larson, there you go.
Oh, I was talking out loud.
Chair recognizes Bill Fairbrother.
Thank you. Bill Fairbrother, Texas Republican County Chairman's Association. We strongly support House Bill 3648. It's a nice short bill, very common sense legislation, and encourage its passage. Thank you.
Okay. Members, any questions? All right. Thanks
Thank
a
you.
lot. Chair calls up Glenn Maxey.
Glenn Maxey, Texas Democratic Party, here in support on Blue Ribbon Lobby Day in my purple shirt, Mr. Goldman's bill. We strongly support House Bill 3648.
Thank you. Members, any questions? All right. How you feeling there, Glenn?
Excellent.
Wow. Good. All right. We have Ashley Fisher, the Secretary of State, here as a resource witness if anyone wishes to ask her any questions. Okay. And with that, Chair recognizes Mr. Goldman to close.
Thank you. I close.
All right. So at this time, the chair leaves House Bill. Y'all are cracking me up. Leaves House Bill 3648 pending at this time. All right, Chair lays out House Bill 1173 by Representative Navarez to please explain your bill.
Madam Chair, I'll be brief. We ran this bill by the committee last session, and I understand the temperature, for lack of a better word, was a little different. And thank you, committee members, for letting us lay out this bill. And again, thank you, Madam Chair, for giving us a hearing. The bill deals with the voter identification of federally recognized Indian tribes. We have 3 in the state of Texas. We have the Alabama Coushatta, which is out east. We have the Tiguas, which are in El Paso County, and of course the Kickapoos, who are in Maverick County. There are other states that allow tribal ID, and you'd be surprised to know which ones. It's Alabama, Georgia, Idaho, Mississippi, North Carolina, Utah, Washington, Kansas, Virginia, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Obviously, these are states that have federally recognized Indian tribes, but there are also states, if you look at the ones that I ticked off, that have voter ID laws, similar to the ones that Texas has. As a result of the federal court case, we believe now is a good time for this to be implemented into the current law and folded into what we've got. It's important to understand that it's very difficult. It's more difficult to get an ID from a federally recognized Indian tribe than it is to get one from a Texas tribe, and we have some resource witnesses to speak to that. The U.S. Transportation Secretary Administration allows federally recognized tribes to use their IDs to board an airplane. You cannot use a commercial, or you cannot use a concealed handgun permit to board an airplane, but you can use it to vote. So it's somewhat conflictive. You know, we can use our concealed permit to vote here, but we couldn't get on an airplane. Yet, federal government allows these IDs to be used to board airplanes, but we can't use it to vote. So I think this is something that we need to square away. And again, each tribe has its own extensive application, and you'll hear from them about that, and I reserve my right to close.
Okay, members, are there any questions? All right, Chair calls up, let's see, who we got? Okay, Carlos Bullock.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. It's an honor to be here. I'm in support of House Bill 1173.
And could you state your name?
My name is Carlos Bullock. I'm here representing the Alabama Coushatta Tribe of Texas. We're located in Polk County. East Texas, about 4 hours away from here. And this is an important bill for tribes around the country, and especially for our tribes. It's very difficult for some of our older people to get state IDs. We live in a reservation that's in the rural area, approximately 20 miles to get to a DMV to get a state ID. I actually have my card that I carry with me, just like I would my driver's license. It goes in there where it has my license, has my enrollment number. I have to show this to show blood quantum. And like
can you explain that? What do you mean?
Blood quantum is how much tribal blood that I have, and then it's listed on here. And every tribe has their own enrollment policies. So getting enrolled is not just saying that you want to be part of a tribe. We have an extensive enrollment process, which includes DNA testing. You have to prove that you're from direct lineal descent from a tribal member. And so that is just one step to getting a tribal card. And this is my membership card. These are, as Representative Navarez said, I can use this to get on an airplane. These are a lot of the only source of identification for a lot of tribal members, and people do carry them around and use them to cash checks. And and of course, some of our local areas, they notice and they understand the tribal ID and they accept it as a form of identification. And we would like to use this also as voter identification. We have, if y'all care to see it, we have holograms on our IDs. These are, I have even crossed into Canada with one before. There are some.
Yeah, the clerk can pass it out. We promise to give it back to you.
Okay, yeah. No, you cannot be a part of our tribe just because you hold it.
What degree of blood lineage do you?
Every tribe.
What's the lowest level?
Well, every tribe has their own enrollment processes. Our tribe, you have to be a quarter Alabama Coushatta blood. we actually have that in our constitution and bylaws that states that. And so every tribe is different. Tiguas and Kickapoos have their own enrollment policies. And we have, you have to apply, you have to go through a background, and you have to do a blood lineage.
Yeah, it looks like we just got something from the Kickapoos.
Yes.
Said they have a 1/4 degree.
Yes.
Kickapoos.
Yeah.
Okay.
And every tribe throughout the country has their own enrollment policies and what is allowed to be in there to enroll in their tribe. And but like I said, it's extremely hard for some of our elders to have any other form of ID, and sometimes that is the only thing that they have. And just because they honestly don't get off the reservation often. And so they've been known to.
Okay, Vice Chair Israel has a question.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairman. Thanks, Mr. Bullock. We do get off the reservation a lot around here in the Texas House of Representatives. And I was just curious, on your card, I thought it would be issued by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. How does that happen between you and the
Well,
BIA?
you can get what's called a certificate degree of Indian blood from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. On there, it says membership card. That means I'm an enrolled member of the Alabama Coshada tribe. But you can get a certificate degree of Indian blood that states your blood quantum. But that is a tribal membership card. And on the back of there, I don't know if you had seen it, it states a federally recognized tribe. And that's that would gives us access to some services like Indian Health Service and things. We have to show our membership cards.
So is it a matter of showing the documentation, and then it looks like you guys have your own printing mechanism to say once we're good to go, you print up the card right. In other words, you don't mail out to Washington for the card.
No.
It's all handled internally within the tribe.
We have that in-house in our own. We have an enrollment department that oversees that, which is its own department and has its own. Like I said, we have our own enrollment procedures.
Okay. Thank you so much for being here.
No, thank you.
Representative Fallon.
Yes, thank you for coming. Just had a couple of questions.
Sure.
Where is the reservation located in Texas?
Our tribe is actually in Polk County, in between Livingston and Woodville. In Polk County, we have approximately 10,200 acres.
And where would be the nearest, maybe, big cities?
Livingston is big for us.
Right. And then
we're about 90 miles northeast of Houston.
Oh, okay, gotcha. And how many members of the tribe?
We have a little over 1,200 now.
1,200 members. And do you know the history of where your people were originally from?
Yes, I didn't even hear.
Where?
Actually, the state of Alabama is named after our tribe. We started migrating in the 1760s westward whenever the Europeans were coming through. We got out ahead of the Trail of Tears. So when a lot of our tribes that we associated with historically were moved into Oklahoma, which was then Indian territory, our tribe moved into this area, into where we're at, in the late 1700s. And a lot of the roads, creeks, are named after some of our old traces. The roads, some of the major roads in the area are actually some of our old trails. And so, and in 1854, the state legislature actually bought 1,280 acres for the Alabamas. The Coshadas were supposed to get 640 acres. Alabama's Coshadas were two separate tribes that migrated together. And then after the Coshadas never got their land, so essentially the Alabamas allowed them to live on to the reservation that we have now, 1,200 acres that we still live on, and essentially becoming the Alabama Coshada tribe.
Oh, that's fascinating. And then when you do the DNA testing, can you differentiate between tribes, or is it more regional?
No,
it would be.
No, we have direct lineal descent, so you have to be. Our DNA testing has to go to your mother or your father.
Okay.
And that's been one change that we've done within the last probably 4 or 5 years, which is a requirement now is DNA testing.
Okay.
And that's becoming something that's becoming common in tribes across the country.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay. Any other questions, members? All right.
Well, I want to thank you for your time. And
Thank you for the history lesson.
Sure.
Fascinating. And you got your ID back.
All right.
It's pretty cool. All right. Chair calls up Alan Vera.
Alan Vera, Chairman, Harris County Republican Party Ballot Security Committee, testifying on HB 1173. We recognize the unique political and legal positions of Native American tribes in Texas, and so we understand and appreciate the desire to recognize their forms of photo ID. We're on the bill only because we lack some information. We don't understand what state agency oversees the ID card process among the tribes, and we don't know what agency regularly or periodically audits for deliberate or inadvertent duplication or other identity problems. If we have reassurance on those areas, we'd be more than happy to support the bill.
Okay. Members, any questions?
Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Chair calls up Glenn Maxey.
Glenn Maxey, Texas Democratic Party, here in support of House Bill 1173 for the reasons the previous witnesses have laid out.
Okay.
Thank you.
Members, are there any questions? All right. So we have Keith Ingram with the Secretary of State as a resource witness. If y'all have any questions, and just
You could answer.
Yes, Keith, come on down.
Good evening, Keith Ingram here from the Secretary of State's Office Elections Division on House Bill 1173.
All right, Representative Swanson, do you have a question?
Oh, yes, I was just wanting you to address what Alan Vera brought up. Do you have any connections or know how that works with their ID?
Not beyond the testimony that we heard earlier from the Alabama Cushatas. That's about all that I know about that ID process.
Okay. Are there any other questions, members? Hi. Thanks, Keith. All right. Is there anyone else who wishes to testify on, for, or against House Bill? I apologize. I'm starting to lose my voice again. 1173. And seeing none, Chair calls up Representative Navarez to close.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think to answer your question, there won't be any oversight, and the reason is these are sovereign nations, so the Secretary of State can't exercise any oversight. But if you look at the packet that we handed out for the Kickapoo, and based on the testimony, the previous witness, it's a lot more difficult to get one of these. And I know the Kickapoo actually employs also some oral history too. In other words, you have to be able to show that you're a member of the tribe, excuse me, based on some oral testimony. I mean, Valerie Swanson can go in with 3 or 4 documents that she can manipulate to get a driver's license. It's not hard. I mean, they may tell you it's hard, but it's not. But to become a member of the tribe and get one of these IDs, there's a lot more vetting that goes into it. A lot more vetting than we do with our ID. And for a couple reasons. One is there's a lot more of us that apply for, it wouldn't be practical for the Texas Department of Public Safety to vet people the way the tribes can vet people. And for another reason, that it's a lot more involved being a member of a federally recognized tribe, and there's a lot more to it than being, a Texan, I think. And there's something to that. But
well, Representative Navarro, there's a lot of other things that go along with being a member of the tribe, so they have to be very selective.
Yes, and so, when you put all those things together, what it speaks to me, and what it speaks to the climate that we're in now is that a good idea whose time has come, and it's allowing these folks to use their ID to vote. It makes sense. I could understand, a couple in the session before, based on the legal climate that we were in regarding the legislation and the bills that were up, why it wasn't a prudent move. I don't see that now, and for that reason, I'd ask for your your consideration of this bill so we can get it moving. Favorable consideration, I should say. Thank you, Madam Chair.
We got some other questions.
Oh,
Sure.
Representative Anderson.
One quick question. Do you know how many recognized tribes we have in the state of Texas?
3.
We have 3.
The 3 that I mentioned: Alabama Cushata, the Kickapoo and Maverick, and the Tiguas in El Paso.
Okay. So just be the 3. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
And to follow up on that would be the number
Chairman
of people that are
Lawson.
in each of the other two tribes. There's 1,200 in Alabama.
I think it's about the same, maybe a little bit more. I think the Kickapoo have a little bit more, but you're more or less dealing with
4,000 people.
about 4,000 to 5,000 people.
Okay. Thank you very much. All right. So with that, Chair leaves House Bill 1173 pending at this time. Now, Chair calls up House Bill 365 and recognizes Representative Springer to explain your bill.
Thank you, Madam Chair and committee. House Bill 365 is a study of a thought that I've actually filed a bill in the 83rd and 84th that looked at doing uniform election dates. The complaint, and probably I should have stuck with my guns in the 84th when I said I wanted to do a study, but I had a whole bunch of people that says, you know, we love voter out turn. We love to know that as many people possible are voting. And it makes it easier. One of the biggest complaints I hear from folks is, you know, we have our March primaries, and we run straight into the Mays, and then if there's runoffs, and then all of a sudden we're coming into November, and they just get voter fatigue. There's a lot of folks who just want to come out once a year, be able to do their civic duty and vote, and know that they can cover everything that would be included on the ballot. So what this bill does is ask this committee to be able to take a look, bring all the stakeholders in, and I've heard from my election clerks and all over, and they have questions on how the process might possibly work, how you would divvy up the cost of those elections. You know, one of them is I've got a school district that may reach into 3 counties, and they're afraid, well, the cost will go up. At the end of the day, costs should go down for all entities. If we don't figure out how to do that, then we probably shouldn't go forward. But the cost should go down for all entities that are involved in the election process. And I know Glenn Maxey back here had testified earlier. I think in the 83rd he actually testified for this bill. Excuse me. And we saw what Austin did when they went from, I think, a single-digit turnout in their mayoral election to 40 to 60%. I firmly believe that we do better as a government when we know the more people and what their thoughts are. And we should not be afraid of voters coming out. We shouldn't be afraid to be able to tell them from this. The one thing, while the study is going on, that I have talked about in the prior ones is, you know, we'll have our small candidates or city councilman who says, I'm afraid of getting lost at the bottom of the ballot. One of the things I've always thought we should do with this, and especially with our new technology and our voting machines, is we should invert the ballot. Start with whoever is the closest to you that affects you the most first, and start at that city councilman to that mayor. And you could do everything on the nonpartisan elections before you then jumped into the partisans, and I'm sure this committee will decide whether we have straight ticket voting or one-punch voting or not, but then be able to continue down the ballot. And so I would rather see my city councilman first and the president last when I go to vote. And I would like to start with bonds and what affects my pocketbook at the beginning. And so with that, I'm happy to answer any questions with this, and if not, I'm sure there's probably a couple witnesses that might like to testify upon that.
Okay. Thank you, Representative Springer. The chair calls Glenn Maxey.
Glenn Maxey, Texas Democratic Party, here being even more purple and supporting House Bill 365. We think that having a study about this, there's a lot of bills, over 24 bills about changing dates of election succession. We hope that you'd go forward with some of them because we'd like to see consolidated elections. But having a study to figure out all the ins and outs of all of this would be great. We support it.
Any questions for Glenn Maxey? Thank you. The chair calls Ed Johnson, Harris County Clerk's Office. Hi, Mr. Johnson.
Hello. Ed Johnson, Harris County Clerk's Office, and we're for the bill. Only comment I would say is, and I'm no lawyer, but in my reading of the bill, it looked like it just referred to the study of November elections. So maybe it'd be a good question to ask if that includes all elections, which I would hope we would include all elections, the primaries and the May elections too, in this study. To find all the problems, because I will tell you there are huge problems with the calendars for these elections, as you well have heard in other bills that we've heard in this committee. So we're in support of it.
Okay. Any questions for Ed Johnson? Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Members, Ashley Fisher is available if anybody has any questions. Looks like there might not be any. Representative Springer, it looks like you're available to close. Anybody have any questions of Representative Springer? Representative Reynolds.
Go ahead. Thank you, Representative Springer, and I'm glad that you brought this bill forward as a study. There have been a whole bunch of bills regarding changing up the elections, eliminating possibly, May elections, consolidating them in March, or just having March and May. So there's all kind of things across the board. And one of the questions I have for you is, does your bill contemplate, as the last witness just testified, eliminating, March primaries, or this is just about?
No,
a little bit more clarification on that.
No, it does not address the March primaries. I think that we would still have to have those partisan election dates, and this committee can figure out whether the March is a good date, whether it should move forward, move backwards, or whatever. So the partisan side of it's not. It really is addressing the May and November ones,
that's
and
what I
bringing
thought.
those May ones in. And I'll say this: the other thing was, and I talked about, hey, I'd rather see the ballot inverse. The other part of that I think a lot of people miss the fact of is we have a November election every year. And then while we think of a lot of times our November elections, there's that in-between one where we do the constitutional election. And I think if mayors didn't want to have a busy ballot, that would be the time to be able to be on that. And school boards, be on that off year. Plus, it would drive more people to be able to vote on our constitutional elections of when we did those as well. And so, I think that's one of those things that needs to be fleshed out in there.
And I think a study would be good, too, because one of the arguments I get from the local mayors or school board is that, that people wouldn't prefer it because those are nonpartisan elections, and then if it gets to November, then it gets mixed up and it becomes more, divisive as a partisan election. And the municipal elections, the school board elections, the school bond elections, they try to keep away from that. So I guess a study would kind of help ferret that out as well.
It definitely would, and I think that, that's one of those things that hopefully as the stakeholders come together and talk about this and the study's done, they'd realize, okay, the constitutional election is a nonpartisan election. That even year... odd year, thank you. I was like, okay, the odd year one, maybe the time that we said and part of that I think I didn't realize when I filed this the first two times was, you have a lot of things. Charters have to be changed.
Yeah,
there's a whole bunch of different. Then you have to discuss and address how do you transition into that. What do you do short terms or you do long terms, and how does that process? And so that's really what this is. I do know that there's a strong desire from the communities to be able to say we really would like to be able to take care of everybody at once. Time is an issue. People will have to make that argument. Is it better to be able to spend an extra 10 minutes on a ballot to be able to do everybody versus having to go to the polls multiple times a year? And so that's sort of that trade-off, and I think we need to hear from everybody on that.
And it also would probably show the significant cost savings that they would have from moving to a single election, right?
That's exactly right. And I think one of the things, the benefit of the November election, especially, and I definitely don't know about Harris County, but I can tell you, in Cook County where I live, one of the challenges with the May election is I really only can vote one day. Because if I want to vote on everything on the ballot, I can only vote on Saturday. Because the early election, I would have to drive over 75 miles to go to all the places because the community college holds theirs 20 miles away.
Wow.
The hospital district holds theirs miles away. The school holds theirs here. And so then the city has theirs. And so you have different ones you may have to drive to because the early voting is at each one of those entities. There's not a consolidated entity. Now, we may be the odd ducks in this one, and maybe the May elections don't work like that in Harris County. But I can tell
I'm in
you,
Fort Bend, but I think it's a good idea.
Fort Bend.
No, thank you.
I'm sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, neighbor in Harris.
I didn't mean to throw you in that group.
Swanson's from Harris.
Okay, we'll go to Valerie to get on that. But
we'll claim you on.
I keep hearing so much in Fort Bend and county affairs that we keep talking about that I keep getting those off. But no, and so I think once again from those citizens that want to be able to vote in all of those elections, giving them that November time that says I can go vote early. I know I have 2 weeks to vote early, not just 1 week to vote early. I think there's huge benefits from it. I think the study makes sense, and it's not us saying we're going to quickly decide this and tell you what you're going to do without really listening to all the
And I like it for another reason, doing the study to get the empirical data, because the only compelling reason I can ever get from the locals in my district, in my community, are, local control. We should have the ability to decide. We shouldn't be, hampered with not being able to do a bond election in May. They could set the bond rates could change. We may need to do it, more swifter. We can't, do it in November. So I'm glad that you brought this bill forward.
All right.
One more question.
Yes, I appreciate you bringing the bill, Representative Springer. I have long felt that we need to just go down to just November of each of the years, and certainly the odd year November would be the ideal one for all these nonpartisan ones. Now, does your bill address whether they would all need to be on the same ballot, or would we still be running around to the firehouse, the hospital, the junior
I would hope
college,
the study would bring back that they all need to be on the same ballot, that our election clerks can come together, get that one ballot for that area, to be able to go through to where you can do that. Otherwise, I think you sort of miss a lot of the gains in this from the citizens' perspective. If you don't have a spot where they can go early vote one time and be done. I get a lot of folks that are independents in my district. They don't vote in the March primaries. They don't care for the partisan aspect of it, but they want to be able to go vote once a year. So that's why I bring it forward.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
With that, I close.
Thank you, Representative Springer. The chair will hold House Bill 365 pending at this time. And the chair now calls Representative Gonzalez to present House Bill 273. Welcome, Chairman Gonzalez.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. I have a committee substitute. How would you like me to proceed talking?
Do we have it? We have it. Everybody's got it. Well, then the chair will call on Representative Larson to lay out the substitute. And if you want to explain the difference to us, Chairman Gonzalez.
Let me tell you what I have. I have got a fantastic bill for you guys to consider.
Really?
Bring it.
This is
we're all ears.
This is it's all I bring. That's all I bring. This is all about eliminating voter confusion. Without prejudice as to what the topic is, this is just eliminating voter confusion. So I'll just tell you what it does. What we're doing is to clarify the propositions on the ballot. What I'd like to do in this piece of legislation is clarify that every proposition must list the entity of the proposition. So it would say the state of Texas proposition, the city of Round Rock proposition, Round Rock ISD proposition. What it goes on to say is the state of Texas should be numerical. The state of Texas proposition 1. The state of Texas proposition 2. It will then say Round Rock City Council proposition A, alpha. The locals are alpha. We are trying to draw as many differences between the propositions so that you are not confused as to what you're voting on. The substitute, what it does is it makes the states come first. Okay. So what we're getting at is if you are, and we have witnesses to tell these stories, but a few years ago, if you were in the city of Houston, there was a Proposition 1 on your ballot. But if you were not in the city of Houston, but in the city of Houston viewership, your Proposition 1, right, was our road infrastructure that we had a few years ago. So imagine that you're in the viewership of the city of Houston, and you're hearing nonstop, vote no on Prop 1, vote no on Prop 1, vote no on Prop 1, but you aren't in the city of Houston. You live in Brazoria County, where I grew up, and you show up, Prop 1 is not that Prop 1. Prop 1 is a very different Prop 1. So we're trying to clarify and make sure that everybody understands which proposition you are voting on. That's what we do. And we got a lot of witnesses with all kinds of wonderful information, but eliminating voter confusion, Madam Chair, is the purpose of this, to make sure you know exactly what you're voting on.
I need all the help I can get. It's so confusing. Members, are there any other questions?
And with that, I reserve the right.
Fantastic bill.
Well, I think so too. I may have a JA spot for you, Lyle Larson.
Okay. And you're going to reserve the right to close?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Thank you.
Chair calls George Hammerling.
Good afternoon, George Hammerline with the Harris County Clerk's Office. We support the bill. Our office had to conduct the election the gentleman was talking about earlier, where you have multiple Prop 1s. Recently, City of Houston had a ballot item, and when they first sent it over, they said, we don't want a title on it. So it would have just been floating on our ballot. And when it said, if this measure passes, we're going to do something. Well, it didn't even tell you what entity it was tied to. So we told them we refused to do it, and they told us we had to, and they finally backed down, and it finally did say City of Houston, Proposition A, but they said, well, we don't want to draw attention to it. So we're like, you got to be kidding, we can't have a ballot with just language floating in between other things. So anyway, we strongly encourage what he's trying to do. Voter clarity is of the utmost. I'll be glad to take any questions.
Members, any questions? Okay, thanks, George. All right, Chair calls up, excuse me, Bill Fairbrother. Pardon me.
Thank you. Bill Fairbrother, Texas Republican County Chairman's Association, strongly for House Bill 273, and it's completely coincidental that Chairman Gonzalez is my state representative. But eliminating voter confusion where possible, particularly in such an easy, straightforward way, seems to be a good thing.
Okay.
Thank you all very much.
Vice Chair Israel.
Yeah, I'd like to mention, I think also for Mr. Fairbrother will well recognize this and maybe speak to it because you represent an area that's in the Austin viewing area. If Austin has a big bond initiative and Round Rock is having a school board election or what have you, then this label could be helpful to folks as well, so that they get more clarity.
Right. And even within the same jurisdiction, I might be for Round Rock ISD Prop 1, but against City of Round Rock Prop 1, yet for ACC Prop 1.
Yeah.
And that can all get very
Lots of
confusing
stuff
to
going on.
voters.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Chair calls up Glenn Maxey.
Thank you. Glenn Maxey, Texas Democratic Party. We are in support of House Bill 273 because Democrats, too, don't like confusion. Any questions?
Any questions?
Sometimes we just can't help it.
Can't help it.
Okay.
Thank y'all.
All right. Chair calls up Julia Parenteau. And pardon me Julia, I know I botched that one.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. It's Parenteau. You did great. I'm Julia Parenteau, Associate Director of Legislative Affairs for the Texas Association of Realtors, and we are testifying for the bill because we represent more than 110,000 real estate professionals throughout the state, and they vote, and we want them to be informed and educated voters. We applaud Chairman Gonzalez and Chairwoman Laubenberg and Representative Hinojosa for taking on this important issue. Chairman Gonzalez and the gentleman from Harris County already mentioned some stories from those areas and about how there is no current statewide standard that specifies how a proposition is to be placed on our ballots here in Texas, leaving it to local entities to decide how they are listed. Some might say Proposition 1, some might just say Proposition, sometimes they're left blank. And our research actually found more than 15 different methods for naming and placing ballots, propositions on the ballot, and that's just in 6 counties in the last 3 election cycles. You can see that data in some material we dropped off at your offices this morning. It may be in your packets. The Harris County issue was a challenge for the legislature that had passed the legislation for Proposition 1 on the homestead exemption. While there was a local proposition, also Proposition 1 in that area, and as Chairman Gonzalez said, the ads for that went to the Houston media market, which is not just the city of Houston. It goes into Fort Bend and all throughout Harris County and into Brazoria. And what you have here in front of you is a transcript of a voicemail we received on Proposition 1 from a voter in Brazoria County who was confused that there were 2 Proposition 1s on the City of Houston ballot because she didn't live there, but she heard the ads for them. And so you can read it here, but she says it's a sad day in this world when you have to lie and deceive people about what a proposition is about. And so, Madam Chair and members, the proposition process is supposed to increase voter participation in government and not create confusion and erode the trust. So we support the committee substitute for House Bill 273. Thank you.
Okay. Any questions, members? Thank you, Julie.
Thanks.
Chair calls up Ed Johnson.
Ed Johnson with Harris County Clerk's Office. Sorry, Madam Chair, I was supposed to be not testifying. We're for the bill.
Okay, thank you. Any questions, members? Appreciate it. All right, and we have Ashley Fisher with the Secretary of State, if y'all have any questions, and seeing none. Okay, is there anyone else who wishes to testify on, for, or against House Bill 273 and committee substitute for House Bill 273? And seeing none, Chair calls up Representative Chairman Gonzalez to close.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A very simple way, we think, to eliminate voter confusion at the polls.
Thank you.
And with that, I close.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
And with that, Chair withdraws a substitute to House Bill 273 and will leave it pending at this time. Okay, so we are moving along, and all right, let's see. Chair lays out House Bill 3285 and calls up Representative Rodriguez to explain your bill.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chairwoman Laubenberg and committee members. It's an honor to be in front of this fine committee. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to lay out House Bill 3285, which would promote transparency and ensure Texans know how their tax dollars are spent for voter outreach. As way of background, each election year, our Secretary of State's office spends millions of dollars on voter education or outreach, but it can be difficult to assess the program's effectiveness. Typically, these expenditures will include radio and TV ads, social media campaigns, sometimes visits by the Secretary of State to various events across Texas, and partnerships with organizations to inform citizens about the voter registration process and election day and early voting processes. Unfortunately, the expenditures and full scope of the program have been difficult to access and therefore hinder our constituents' ability to hold state officials accountable. In future elections, as part of our responsibility and the state's responsibility, certainly we've partnered to make sure we educate voters and encourage electoral participation. This bill simply would call for the Secretary of State's office to prepare a report on expenditures for voter education programs after every general election. It would include metrics that would be sufficient for us to gauge the program's impact and demonstrate to our constituents how their money was being spent. That report would be due by the beginning of each legislative session to this committee and to its Senate counterpart. Very simply, that's what the bill does, and happy to answer any questions. Reserve the right to close, Madam Chairwoman.
Okay, are there any questions, members? All right, thank you. And so the chair calls up Ed Johnson.
Ed Johnson with the Harris County Clerk's Office, and we're against the bill. I just think that, that's what we have the State Comptroller's Office for, to do audits of state departments to find out where they're spending their money. Why we need to put it into election code, I don't understand. Also, this is a very busy time of the year for the Secretary of State's office. We now have, a November election every year, and we're pushing the school districts and cities to those Novembers, hopefully. And they always usually have runoff elections, and those runoff elections occur during the month of December, usually the second week in December. So the Secretary of State is real involved with all the counties in putting on the December elections, which basically canvassing goes all the way up to Christmas time. Immediately after that, the EAC, that's the federal agency that runs elections, has a report that all the counties have to submit to the Secretary of State's office to have sent nationally. They have to compile it, all 254 counties, and send it out nationally for a deal. So this January month that they want this finding in is very, very hectic in the election world every year because we have all of these reports showing. But once again, back to if we're auditing somebody, we should have the comptroller do it.
Okay, members, are there any questions? Okay, thank you, Ed. And Chair calls up Anthony Gutierrez.
Thank you. Anthony Gutierrez with Common Cause Texas. We're testifying in favor of this bill. Aside from the things that Representative Rodriguez mentioned about transparency and accountability, we do a tremendous amount of work on voter education and civic engagement. Having this type of disclosure from the Secretary of State's office would be tremendously helpful to us because Texas is just an incredibly expensive state to campaign in. We know how difficult it is to get the word out on things like voter ID. If we don't know what people like the Secretary of State are doing and what their resources are going towards, it's hard for us to really sort of do things that are complementary. If we knew that their money was being spent on media in certain media markets or campus visits on colleges, we could plan accordingly to really be helpful, productive partners to get the word out in other ways and kind of combine our resources, make sure all of us are making the best possible use of our time and our money. So we are in favor. We hope you guys will support this bill.
Okay, members, are there any questions? All right, thank you. Chair President George Hammerling.
George Hermon with Harris County. We were against the bill, and I wish not to testify since Ed already has. Thanks.
Okay, members, any questions since George? Wait, George, since you're up here, we got a question. Representative Reynolds.
Just a real brief question. I guess I read the, and I could have asked this of Ed too. I read the LBB reported. It looks like there's no fiscal note attached to it. So basically, there's no additional, financial concerns there. Really, we're just talking about, time. I mean, there's, and I think the overwhelming crux of the bill is to, for transparency, to give, voters transparency. I mean, I don't know about you, but my constituents, they want more transparency, not less, and to hold us
I just
accountable.
know that anytime we call the Secretary of State's office and say, are you going to be doing any media in this market, they'll tell us. And also, but then other components, I guess I get worried that they'll have to start, because there are only a few people that answer the phone for our questions. And we hate to see a limited bandwidth get burned up on kind of doing reports that, because if you have to quantify media exposure of when someone from the Secretary of State office goes to Houston, and then you got to say, okay, well, that was on Channel 2 News and Channel 11, and what was their, I mean, all of a sudden it seems like their whole shift of what they're doing to might change, that if they have to start quantifying everything they do, the easiest thing to do is just throw it all on TV and go, here's the buy, here's how many points we got.
Okay, I was just trying to make sure I understood the concern.
Our concern is trying to get limited staff on the phone as it is.
Okay,
we wouldn't want them burying themselves any deeper and saying, we don't have time to talk to you, we're preparing a report.
I see. So it was really your concern is their capacity.
Availability
Got
of
it.
them, yes, sir.
Okay, that's okay. I understand that. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, and we have Keith Ingram with Secretary of State. If y'all have any questions. Okay, come on down, Keith.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, Keith Ingram here from the Elections Division, the Secretary of State's office, here on House Bill 3285 as a resource.
Hi, Keith. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Keith, for being here today. And just to get any clarification, would your office need additional manpower in order to handle the requirements of this bill?
We would not.
Okay. And do you think that it would tie up additional time and resources in your office, or?
It would take a certain amount of time to prepare. I don't think it would be an inordinate amount of time.
Would that prohibit you from taking care of the other responsibilities that you're already doing, or?
I would certainly hope not.
Okay. Now, and I understand here, I guess from what I see, there'll be no fiscal impact to the Secretary of State's office.
That's right. The only thing that is of concern in this bill is some of the elements in particular.
Could you lay those out, please?
Yes. Particularly number A5 and 6 and 7. Those kind of details. If all that we're after is something kind of broad, then that wouldn't be a problem. But a lot of the I didn't know anything about this before I started doing this job, but each of the vendors who put bids in for this contract have kind of their own secret sauce for how they get extra. So you pay for one spot and you get 2 or 3 others, and so they each have their own formulas for that, and so I don't want to be obligated to disclose something that will expose their trade secrets, and then we won't have anybody bid for the contract. So that's the only concern we've got, is that if we get too detailed in that particular information, we can say generally this is how much of the money was spent in this market and on these stations, but I'm afraid that if we get very detailed on it, that we could be limiting our pool of people who will bid on the contract.
Is that something that your office could work on, Representative Rodriguez? Is that something your office could work with the author on?
Oh, absolutely, you bet. And I don't know for sure that it would require the exposure of trade secrets as it is. It's just something I'm concerned about.
They are very
Thank you, Madam
secretive. Yes, I'm sorry, Representative Reynolds. Yeah, I know. They're very secretive about their buys and their formulas. I know. Exactly. Any other questions, members? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else who wishes to testify on, for, or against House Bill 3285? And seeing none, Chair calls up Representative Rodriguez.
Thank you, Chairwoman. I appreciate your time this afternoon, and heard the feedback. We're certainly willing to work with Secretary Pablos and his office. I mean, this is, I think, a very simple bill in that, I think all of our objective is to make sure we're getting folks out to the polls, right? It's in everybody's interest to do that. So if we are putting dollars out there to make sure that they know their rights, they know where to go vote, then I think it's in our best interest to make sure that money is being used effectively. So that's simply why we wanted to get a report back on how that money is being dispersed. If it's being effective, certainly, in the interest of making sure that everybody knows what they're doing come election time. So appreciate the conversation. Like I said, I've had informal conversations with Secretary Pablos, and we're willing to work with his office to make sure we get this right, because I think it's that important to Texas.
Right.
And with that, happy to answer questions, or I will close.
Does anybody else have anything? Think not.
Great.
So you close.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. So right now, the chair leaves House Bill 3285 pending at this time. And you want to...
All right, then. It is my honor as the chair to call on Chair Laubenberg to introduce House Bill 3422.
Okay, so thank you, Madam Chairman. And during the interim, or last session, we passed legislation that would require a cross-state voter registration checking program. And then we found out during the interim that there are different options out there, but one of the options costs quite a bit of money, another option does not, but they need information that we can't give them right now. And birth date and the last 4 digits of the Social Security number. So this piece of legislation would allow the Secretary of State to include that information to use for one of the cross-check systems, the Kansas model, which was developed by the Secretary of State in Kansas. Now, one of the concerns that we had was what happens to that personal information once they receive it. And so the Kansas model, there is no charge. Once they get the information and they run the duplicates, they make it available only to that state. Then once that state has done their gathering and checks, then that information is deleted. And we had the Secretary of State up here to, verify all that.
Okay.
So that's basically what this does, is it allows the Secretary of State to use voter information to have another option in the interstate cross-check program that by law they are required to set up a system. So.
Okay.
You don't have any questions?
Any questions of Chair Laubenberg?
And I reserve the right to close.
Okay, then the chair calls Cindy Weatherby. I love your description, Ms. Weatherby. League of Women Voters and semi-retired transportation consultant.
Thank you.
You never quite retire from.
That's true. Although I have retired from finding my testimony here. I was so surprised by this quick meeting.
We're moving fast.
I mean, it has disappeared on me. I do have some information to share with you. We are testifying on House Bill 3422 today. I'm testifying as a member.
Probably ought to repeat your
name. My name is
and-
Cindy Weatherby, and I'm testifying as a member and on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Texas. We appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. The League is very much in support of voter registration systems that are accurate, and we strongly believe in modernizing our 19th century voter registration system in Texas to take advantage of the technology available in the 21st century. So from our extensive study on that subject, we also believe that technology includes online voter registration, and that would also benefit the interstate cross-checks. We have a very mobile society, especially in Texas. I've checked with numbers from our Texas demographer from 2016, and in recent years, Texas has been the #1 destination for domestic migration in the states. Between 2005 and 2013, 4.8 million people moved to Texas from other states. They came from all the other 49 states. However, the majority came from just 10 states: Arizona, California, Colorado, Florida, Georgia, Illinois, Louisiana, New Mexico, New York, and Oklahoma. And they moved to 251 of our counties, but more than half of those moved to just 6 counties, our urban counties of Bexar, Dallas, El Paso, Harris, Travis, and Tarrant counties. I'm guessing that most of those people who migrated, and I could say pretty assuredly, most of those people who came into our state had no idea how to cancel the registration in the state that they left, didn't think about canceling that registration. And I know from talking with them as I've registered people, they don't know how to register in our state. So it's certain that they came from those states with very different voter registration systems. Cross-checking can be very helpful, and we do caution, however, that the interstate cross-check system offered free gratis by the state of Kansas has its flaws, and there have been numerous problems with individuals who were eliminated due to wrongful matches, and there have been 3 states who have actually already pulled out of the Kansas system: Florida, California, and Oregon. We would highly suggest that you consider the ERIC system, and I know that there are expenses that are involved with that. The League would go so far as to say that because of the attributes of that system and the higher quality that's provided by the ERIC system, that is a nonprofit organization governed by the states that participate in it. We would even go so far as to say that we would help raise funds if you would accept those contributions.
All right, Ms. Weatherby, thank you for your testimony. Any questions for Ms. Weatherby? Ms. Weatherby, I did have a question about the ERIC system. It's been a while since I've heard that phrase, but is...
ERIC stands for Electronic Registration Information Center, and it's a more rigorous data matching and security system. I'm sure Mr. Ingram could speak more to the details of that.
And to clarify, you mentioned something about the Kansas example. I'm guessing that it's because there was maybe somebody named Carlos Gomez, or of similar, Cliff Jones.
Mm-hmm.
Is that where you get into trouble?
It's just not as rigorous a matching system, not as automated. For a little bit of fun, one thing that I should pass along, I also included some information that was forwarded to us from Project Vote in with my written testimony because they were planning to be here but were unable to. I was able to utilize that information in putting together the testimony that you have before you. And of note, Governor Rick Scott was eliminated from his voter pool through a system that was also not quite as rigorous. And for fun,
I do like being that running back from Katie.
Yeah, you still got it.
Thank you. I was so frazzled by not having my remarks here in front of me. We just decided, we'd see, so how many of those other people are out there that might be duplicates that if the governor could be eliminated by a similar system of cross-checking, how many people on your committee might be? I guess the good news is that the chairwoman, the vice chair, and Ms. Swanson, I couldn't find any immediate matches. But
They're
even
special.
But even any of the other members of the committee had multiples that they will find. I'm not saying that that person is going to match with them. I'm just saying that this is a pervasive situation, and we want to be as rigorous as we can because we really believe in the security of the voter roll, and some interstate cross-matching is really beneficial to making that happen.
Okay. All right. Any other questions? Thank you, Ms. Weatherby. Appreciate your testimony. The chair calls Glenn Maxey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Glenn Maxey, the Texas Democratic Party. We registered in opposition to House Bill 3422, sending Texas private information to out-of-state vendors who have no responsibility for protection against identity theft shouldn't be allowed. The cross-check program in Kansas could be, instead of it, we could use the ERIC program that's been alluded to. We believe that that's a much more secure, has much more rigorous information. My understanding is that the ERIC system matches our data, and our data stays in Texas when they do the match. So we're not sending our people's private information outside the state. They're matching to our file. And that way our Social Security numbers and date of births are not, and people's information is not going out of state. We also believe that since it is the more rigorous program, there's more states involved, it's run by the consortium of the states as a nonprofit, that's the way we should go. And we too believe that we could raise money from private sources to fund this program if we use the ERIC system. I think to do the whole thing would be an easy lift to raise that money from nonprofit sources across the state.
Okay. Any questions for Glenn Maxey? Thank you, Glenn Maxey. The chair calls Ed Johnson.
Ed Johnson here with the Harris County Clerk's Office, and we're in favor of the bill. Before I started working with the Harris County Clerk's Office, I also worked in the tax office in the voter registration department. I was there in the tax office, one of the associate directors when Katrina happened, and we had a lot of new people from Louisiana that moved over to the Houston area. And we started doing a cross-check. We had a partnership with Louisiana and started doing a cross-check there and found that multiple voters were registered in both states. In fact, as they voted in Harris County, we would be notifying Louisiana that they had now voted here, and found that they were trying to go back and vote in Louisiana at the same time. So not only are they registered in 2 spots, but they were actually trying to vote in those spots too. So the cross-check is very, very important. As a person that was, because this was just between between a county and a state at the time, it was very difficult to get 100% match on the roll because you have a lot of Edward Johnsons on the list, and so it's a very common name. Chairman, what you're doing with the last 4 digits of the social and the birth date, enables you to get that hard match where you can make sure you're matching the right Ed Johnson and you're not canceling the wrong person. And the beauty of our system is if by some chance you did accidentally cancel the wrong voter, that's why you have a provisional vote. And a voter could pass a provisional ballot, it would re-register them back into Texas, and their vote would probably be counted because there would be follow-up to determine was that person canceled in error, and the ballot board would be able to count that vote.
Okay. Any questions for Mr. Johnson? Thank you, Mr. Johnson. The chair calls Alan Vera.
Alan Vera, Chairman, Harris County Republican Party Ballot Security Committee, testifying in support of HB 3422. One of our subcommittees goes through voter registrations in Harris County every month. Through open records requests, we download recently approved voter registrations and we vet them. We go through and compare that information against other publicly available data from the Harris County Appraisal District, from the Department of Public Safety, etc. Our goal is simply to make sure that the people who've registered are who they say they are, and to avoid having people registered more than once. Without the last 4 digits of the social and without the date of birth, that's hard. And we have a committee of 12 that works at least 4 nights a week just on one county and on voter registrations just in the last 30 days. This bill calls for the Secretary of State to make available the dates of birth and the last 4 digits of the social. These 2 bits of additional information make a huge difference in the ability to accurately match voter identities. Given the number of voter records involved and the number of states involved, we don't see how the participating states could possibly match voters accurately without these 2 key data points. It's not only important to election integrity among the states, it's important to preventing innocent voters from being mistakenly tagged as being illegally registered in more than one state. Those 2 last data points make a difference. So this bill protects voters from unnecessary hassles and improves election integrity. We recommend you pass Bill HB 3422 out of committee. Any questions?
Any questions for Mr. Vera? Thank you, Mr. Vera. The chair calls Bill Fairbrother.
Good evening, Bill Fairbrother, Texas Republican County Chairman's Association, in favor of House Bill 3422. As the chairman mentioned, we thought we had passed this bill last session. A couple of hiccups on the road in terms of data need to be clarified, so we support clarifying it. In a less stressful budget year, we would support going for both cross-check programs, but given finances as they are, this one is at the right price, and we support anything we can do to cut down on multiple registrations and make our rolls as clean as possible.
Any questions for Mr. Fairbrother? Thank you, Mr. Fairbrother. We have the Secretary of State here, Keith Ingram. Keith,
Yeah.
why don't you come up, and you're where the rubber meets the road, so why don't you tell us how this would work?
Good evening, members of the committee. Keith Ingram here, Texas Secretary of State's office, here on House Bill 3422 as a resource.
And I have a couple of questions.
Yes,
Okay.
Chair Lumber.
Sure. And Keith, it looks like we heard that you had more states in the ERIC system than the Kansas system, but according to you, there are about 28 states in Kansas, the Kansas model, and about 20, which is, close enough, but...
So the thing about the Kansas one is that it's a new event every January.
Mhm.
They've had as many as 29. They've had I think 26 this year. So it varies a little bit. ERIC, they have 20 dues-paying members plus the District of Columbia, so they've got 21, and that's set and it's an ongoing process.
Right. And, you could parallel this. If we had the money to do the ERIC, you could still do the Kansas.
That's right.
And they delete that information. Once,
As soon as the matches are done, they send them to the states and they delete everything that they've got.
right. And isn't it more accurate if you have more specific? I mean, if there were 2 Jody Lovenbergs, we're going to definitely have, I would think, different birth dates, but you never know.
Right. So if we get matches that match on first name, last name, date of birth, and
last four of the social, that's a pretty good match. It's still weak, and you still might have, a John Smith with those data points. And what we commit to doing is whenever we get potential matches from the Kansas crosscheck, we are going to do further scrubbing, and if the middle initials don't match or the middle names don't match, then we're not sending that to the county as a potential match. And then if we can get the full 9 from the county the other county where they're registered, then we would do that comparison as well, because it is not our goal to knock people off the rolls that don't need to be knocked off, but we do want to make sure that we have the best voter roll possible with regard to interstate matching. One benefit that ERIC has that crosscheck doesn't have is it also looks for in-state duplicates, and the people who've participated in ERIC have found that to be the biggest benefit, that they've eliminated millions of in-state duplicate registrations as well as the interstate duplicate registrations.
Don't y'all have something now that you're looking at the in-state?
We don't have any ongoing program to look for intrastate duplicates. There's a bill that would require us to do that I don't know if it's been set for hearing, but we do look for duplicates at the time of registration now. So if someone is entering a voter registration application into the system, it'll pull up all the Keith Ingrams in the state as the person is keying it in, and gets the list underneath it will get smaller and smaller as more data points are entered until there's only one, and then they can tell that county, I'm canceling your voter.
I have a question as well. I'm curious about whether the motor voter process that we have. So if someone goes to DPS and checks off, I want to be registered to vote, there's a lot of those folks are coming from out of state. How can you walk us through that process and what happens then?
Nothing necessarily happens with their voter registration in the other state. It's my understanding, having moved to Arkansas and back here, that both in Arkansas and in Texas, whenever I applied for a driver's license in the other state, they made me surrender my out-of-state driver's license, but we don't have a process like that with voter registration.
So the data, if I'm a motor voter registrant, the date, because there's more data that's provided electronically than if I'm getting registered at a storefront or at a community event.
Right, but the information that DPS sends to us from that motor voter registration is only what is required by the voter registration application itself. So they may get other information, but they don't send it to us, and we wouldn't have a way to use that information.
I'm wondering if this could be coordinated with that in the language of the bill, because they do grab so much information, and it's an automated process. Is there a way to improve on that for what the chair is trying to do with her bill?
I don't know. Maybe it's worth talking to DPS about.
Yeah. Is there anybody from DPS here today? Not that's willing to
admit it.
Confess. Okay. Well, thank you for answering my questions. Appreciate it. Any other questions? Go ahead, Ron.
Keith, do you have any idea, because one of these, the Kansas system has no cost to it. The ERIC system that's mentioned, do you have any idea of the cost on that?
Yes, I talked to Eric last summer for the interim hearing. We submitted an interim hearing report, and the estimate is for Texas for the first year. The reason why it's more expensive the first year is because one of the obligations with ERIC, you get the great list maintenance, but one of the obligations is they want you to reach out to every eligible but unregistered voter with a postcard, and that initial mail out is what is the driver of the first year expense. And so the estimates are based upon the experience of participating members in ERIC right now. The estimate is that Texas would have to pay somewhere between $750,000 and $1.2 million for that first year mail out. Thereafter, the cost of being in ERIC would be about $244,000 a year estimated. So it wouldn't be a huge ongoing cost. It's just that first year that would be expensive.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay, any other questions of Mr. Ingram? Go ahead, Ms. Swanson.
Yes, hi. I had some people ask whether it would be helpful for citizens to come through the list and report any possible duplicates that they found.
I don't know. I don't know if they would have very much success if they don't have the driver's license number or the Social Security number to work with. It's worth a shot.
Okay, but if they found some suspicious ones, they could report it to you and you would look at it?
Yes, or to the county voter registrar, because if a county voter registrar receives information that indicates a voter has moved, they can send the confirmation notice to that voter and confirm their address. So it would be more appropriate to send that to the voter registrar of the county.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Any questions? All right, members. Chair Lomberg, you want to close?
Sure. Okay. We've passed legislation requiring that the Secretary of State do a cross-check program. And, we want to make sure it's accurate. We don't want to throw anyone off. And, we ran into the glitch of the being able to supply the birth date and last four of the social to make sure that they're much more accurate. This is a, multi-state participating program. It gives the Secretary of State another option. And so with that, I ask for y'all's favorable consideration and close.
Okay. Well, the chair will leave House Bill 3422 pending at this time. Do you want to talk about the next bill?
Yeah, I'm going to do. Okay, Representative King has been ill, as we all know, so I am going to lay out his bill. And, okay, so let me get everything here in place. Oops. Okay. 2481, the committee substitute, and this was Chairman King's bill, but since he is ill today, I am going to be laying his bill out for him. All right, and so bear with me, and we have great resources here, so you will have plenty of folks to ask questions to. The committee substitute to House Bill 2481 contains updates to the Texas voter identification laws that follow the directive of the Federal Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. And I ask for your patience. This is going to take a few minutes to lay this bill out. Since 2011, the courts have given the state differing and ever-changing guidance on how we can identify voters at polling locations. Most recently, the Fifth Circuit, in an en banc opinion this past summer, provided Texas a roadmap to address certain findings of a federal district court. The Fifth Circuit has always said the legislature has the absolute right to craft a permanent remedy for our voter ID laws. It is important to recognize that this bill would amend the current voter ID statute passed in 2011. It does not amend or change any interim court order. The committee substitute to 2481 was changed to make it identical to Senate Bill 5 as it was engrossed. And what that does, the committee substitute creates procedural safeguards to ensure that election officials can properly attribute a declaration to its voters. First, the bill puts into statute a program started by the Secretary of State's office in 2013, mobile units that provide election identification certificates around the state. Second, the bill creates a program for registered voters who are unable to obtain a photo ID, permitting them to, 1, sign a declaration, and 2, present as an alternative form of ID, and 3, vote a full ballot. The declaration form allows a voter to declare that he or she has a reasonable impediment to obtaining a photo ID and attest to the truthfulness of their statement. The offense of intentionally, emphasizing intentionally filing a false declaration is created, which carries the penalty of a third-degree felony. A declaration was used in the last election, and with over 8.9 million votes cast, 13,500 declarations were used. First, an election clerk will affix the voter's unique, I'm talking about the substitute, will affix the voter's unique identification number or VUID to the voter's declaration. The combo form either has printed on it the voter's name and VUID, or the county will have an electronic poll book that prints a label to stick onto the combo form. The sticker has the VUID on it as well. Second, an election clerk will mark in a space on the combination form that the voter used a declaration to vote. Third, as I mentioned earlier, these are legal terms. That's why you need a lawyer. The mens rea, culpable mental state, to prove that the voter made a false statement was raised from knowingly to intentionally. This change will ensure that those persons who are seeking to subvert Texas voting laws intentionally face this penalty, while those who are merely relying on bad information from an election clerk or any other source would not be charged with this serious offense. This is a concern raised by MALDEF. And fourth, the sub allows an expired ID of no more than 2 years rather than 60 days as an acceptable form of ID. The interim court order allows for photo IDs to be used if they have no expired, if they have not expired more than 4 years. If less than 2 years expired, that ID is acceptable to vote a regular ballot with no affidavit. If it is over 2 years, you can still vote. You just have to use the affidavit to vote a regular ballot. And note that the committee substitute for 2481 allows the elderly over 70 to vote with an expired ID and have full access to unlimited expired ID and have full access to the ballot. And, how you will vote under this bill. You can vote if you are legally registered to vote and to be eligible, a United States citizen, a resident of the county where you submit the registration application, at least 18 years old on election day, and not a convicted felon, but you may be eligible to vote if you have completed your sentence, probation, and parole. You have not been declared by a court exercising probate jurisdiction to be totally mentally incapacitated or partially mentally incapacitated without the right to vote. And it is currently a second-degree felony to illegally vote, Election Code Section 64.012. So when you go vote, you must present a photo ID, and I'll go ahead and give the list. A Texas driver's license, a Texas personal identification card, Texas license to carry card, Texas election identification certificate, U.S. military identification card, U.S. passport or passport card, U.S. certificate of citizenship. And if you don't have the approved photo ID with you, then you may vote provisionally, and then you have 6 days to present the ID. If you are unable to obtain an approved photo ID because of reasonable impediments, you may sign a declaration of a reasonable impediment, present a supportive document of identification, and then you can vote a full ballot, not a provisional ballot. Reasonable impediments from declaration: lack of transportation, lack of birth certificate or other documents needed to obtain a photo ID, work schedule, lost or stolen identification, disability or illness, family responsibilities, and a photo ID required by law has been applied for but not yet received. All right, photo ID is acceptable under the new Section 63.0101B with a declaration of reasonable impediment. Government document with name and address of voter, including a voter registration certificate, a document with the name and address of a voter, that would be a current utility bill, a bank statement, a government check, or a paycheck. A certified copy of a domestic birth certificate or other document confirming birth that is admissible in a court of law and establishes a person's identity. A declaration of reasonable impediment form states the voter's reasonable impediment to obtaining an acceptable form of photo ID and states that the voter is the same person whose name appears on the alternative identification document. The declaration facilitates your vote but is not attached to your ballot. If you simply just left your ID in your vehicle as stated, you can vote provisionally and bring your ID within 6 days. The Secretary of State must retain precinct election records for 22 months for state and federal elections and 6 months for local elections. We believe the declaration of reasonable impediment to fall under the definition we believe the declaration of reasonable impediment to fall under the definition of precinct election records. With regard to the offense of making a false statement on the declaration of reasonable impediment, this is not just a perjury statement. It is a perjury statement to a government body about an activity that is at the bedrock of our system of government. Given the serious nature of these actions, the penalty for the offense of making a false statement, intentional false statement on a declaration, is a third-degree felony. Adding this penalty will slightly change the oath on the declaration to reflect this added penalty. Currently, the only remedy for falsifying this declaration would be perjury or tampering with a government document. Okay. And that pretty much outlines the bill. And members, I'm going to call up the Attorney General's office. I am so sorry, because I know there will be some questions.
Madam Chair, Brantley Starr, Attorney General's office, here as a resource witness to answer legal questions about the bill.
Okay, members, do you have any questions? And Chair, I'm going to recognize Chairman Chia, pardon me, who may have some questions. I'm sorry, it's the season. It's killing me.
Madam Chair, do you have some questions?
Yes, Vice Chair Israel.
What was your name again?
Brantley Starr,
Brantley
with the Attorney
Starr.
General's office.
Mr. Starr, who wrote this bill? Do you know?
Who wrote the bill? I believe it was the Senate. It was in the Senate. It was Chair Huffman, who was the author of Senate Bill 5.
Do you know who was involved in helping her put it together, I guess is the question I'm looking at.
Her staff did.
Were you involved in any of the language?
Those are privileged questions, so we can't divulge privilege in committee.
So we don't know if I asked you if anybody in the Attorney General's office helped to put this bill together, you can't answer that?
That's privilege. We don't answer privileged questions in committee.
Okay, so the answer is can't say.
Correct.
What's the purpose of the bill from your perspective?
The purpose of the bill is to address the Fifth Circuit's concerns with discriminatory effect and discriminatory purpose.
If the purpose of the bill is to respond to Judge Ramos?
Well, it's the Fifth Circuit ruling that this would be responsive to. Judge Ramos had the predicate to the Fifth Circuit ruling.
Then I'm wondering, but we had this interim order as a result of where we are now, is we're in interim order as we work forward on whether or not we are discriminatory or not.
That's correct. There is the interim order in place.
Can you tell us the difference between this bill and the interim order?
I have that mapped out. I thought you might ask. So I can outline the differences between this bill and the current state of the law, and this bill and the interim order.
Okay.
So against the current law, this adds a mobile EIC unit in the first part of the bill. It allows those who are 70 or older to vote with an ID that's expired no matter how long it's been expired, is the second change. Third change is it enlarges the 60-day expiration period to 2 years for those who are under age 70. Fourth change is you can use an ID that's been expired for longer than 2 years to vote by affidavit. And then the last point is it clarifies what the criminal penalty is.
I noticed some more differences.
Sure, those are the key ones. I'm happy to address any further ones.
Okay, good. Well, I noticed on the affidavit, because we talked about this in the interim, that there was a reasonable impediment declaration.
Correct.
And the current one, as recommended by the judge, it has several reasons why ID is not being presented. And those are also in the bill. But there's one item that is not in the bill, and that is just check marking other reasonable impediment or difficulty. In other words, allowing the voter to explain, this is why I don't have my ID, because it didn't meet any of these 6 other things. So
that's
there's
correct.
no...
And the list I went over first was a comparison to the current state of the law, SB 14. And so I've got this other list. That's the list as the comparison to the interim remedy. And that's, of course, in there is the removal of the other box.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the thousands of affidavits that were cast, the reasons generally fell into several different categories. Either one, there was another legal path for them to vote, and they were using other to circumvent that legal path. An example is, I left my ID somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
The legal path to vote in that circumstance has always been a provisional ballot. All right, if you left your ID in the car, you cast a provisional, and then you show your ID to the voter registrar within 6 days, 7 days. And then your provisional ballot is counted. So the affidavit and the other box were not meant to circumvent the legal process for voting there. A number of the other reasons expressed properly fit into other categories. One person said that they had a heart transplant, but sickness or disability is already a box above other that they can and should have checked.
Do you know why other was removed?
No, I think that's the bill author's choice after surveying the actual answers that were given in the November election.
An example that occurred to me as I was reading through this is someone is trying to vote and they're embarrassed that they don't have their ID. So they might say, you know what, I lost it, because there's an urgency to vote. The way the bill is written right now, I, Celia, am embarrassed about losing my ID, which anyone who knows me knows that it happens from time to time. And if I say to the elections judge, I want to vote, and the elections judge presents me a declaration, and I'll say, well, I'm just going to say that I lost it, then that's under the bill, it's a third-degree felony. Correct?
What box would they be checking? Lost or stolen ID?
Well, if I really I said I lost it, but I really did have it, which is what some of the anecdotal stories that we were hearing after the last election is that there were individuals who checked the wrong thing because they wanted to vote. And in reality, if I'm putting my own experience on there, none of these boxes applied. I lost it, but I said I lost it, but I had it. And then after the fact, people were saying, well, then you shouldn't have voted because you really did have an ID. You just didn't tell us because you were too embarrassed to tell us. If that scenario happened, then that becomes a third-degree felony under this bill.
I think that's why the Senate clarified and ratcheted up the mens rea for the crime, and it's not knowing, it's intentional. And so if in the example that you're describing, you're saying you were embarrassed because you lost it, if it were, under my car seat and I didn't know where it was, well, that's a difficult case for a prosecutor to bring, and especially for a prosecutor to win, that you intentionally deceived the poll workers, because at that point you didn't know where it was. You did lose it. So I think that's why they corrected that concern by saying it's intentional rather than a knowing violation. If you really did know that it was under your car seat, then that's intentionally misleading a poll worker, and that could bring the offense into play.
And who prosecutes in this kind of a situation?
It's a combination of local prosecutors as well as the Attorney General's Office for Election Code Offenses.
What are the human resources that the Attorney General's Office has right now to prosecute cases?
We generally have 2 prosecutors who work on white-collar crimes, and we have several investigators who can also investigate those crimes in addition to other crimes they have on their docket.
Okay. Do you anticipate that there might be an increase in, if this were actually to become law, do you think that that might be an increase in investigations?
It's possible. We could have had that increase already, and we haven't seen a phenomenal uptick in the number of referrals that we've received. We have seen more, but it's certainly things that the agency can absorb, given its current budget.
If this bill were to pass, would the judge's ruling supersede the bill?
If this bill were to pass, would the judge, which ruling are we speaking of?
Judge Ramos.
Would her ruling on an interim affidavit supersede this bill? Or what ruling? She's had multiple rulings.
Well, her most recent ruling, well, we just got word today, Madam Chair, about another ruling, so I'm not.
If I might, Madam Chair.
Hold on.
I have more
Okay.
questions, but I think I want to
Okay.
get my notes together and.
Hold on. I'm going to do Representative Fallon.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. What's the current state of the litigation, the voter ID litigation?
It changed a few minutes ago, so what we had was ever-changing. We may be here for a while.
We should have gone with that.
So what happened is originally, basically, we had a private group of plaintiffs and the Department of Justice who were involved in the lawsuit against us in federal district court. Those claims were constitutional claims, a poll tax claim, and then under the Voting Rights Act, a discriminatory effect and purpose claim. And those two claims are the ones that are remaining in this lawsuit. It went up to the Fifth Circuit, and they said those are the two claims that should be proceeded on. The court found that the Fifth Circuit found that there was a discriminatory effect. Hence, it told the legislature that they had the opportunity to pass a cure, which Senate Bill 5 is. And the second thing is it remanded for the district court to consider a discriminatory purpose claim. It had considered evidence that the Fifth Circuit found was impermissible. So this afternoon, I haven't fully digested that opinion. It was 10 pages, and it went back and re-looked at the evidence. We and the Department of Justice had both asked for the court to wait and consider the passage of Senate Bill 5 as it contemplates whether or not there was a discriminatory purpose. The court declined that request and went ahead and proceeded to rule. I'll just note that in the Fifth Circuit, what the Fifth Circuit has done traditionally is to adopt the middle ground approach that the Department of Justice has forged. And here they asked the district court to wait and see what happens with Senate Bill 5, and if it passes, the whole case would go away in the eyes of the Department of Justice.
Okay. So that was the push, the push to make this change in the bill?
That's correct. It was in response to the Fifth Circuit's ruling.
Do you think this bill meets the criteria laid out in the en banc opinion?
We do at the Office of the Attorney General, but so does the Department of Justice, who's always charted that middle ground approach.
That's what my next question was going to be, where the Department of Justice sits on this.
They had a pending discriminatory purpose claim, and once Senate Bill 5 passed the Senate, they dropped their claim and asked the court to wait to rule on discriminatory purpose until after a session, and the legislature had a chance to finally enact this law.
Would it be fair to say that the Department of Justice is on Texas's side on this?
On Texas' side, if Senate Bill 5 passes.
Okay, all right. And then what are the significant changes between this bill and the current law and the interim order?
And the current law, it's the mobile EIC unit. If you're 70 or older, you can use an expired ID from any time it's expired. It changes the 60-day expiration for those under 70 to a 2-year expiration of when you can use that ID to vote a regular ballot. And also, if you have an expired ID from more than 2 years, you can use it to cast the affidavit to cast a ballot. Okay. And then it addresses the criminal penalty as well.
Okay. And I just want, Madam Chair, just to take note of the 8.9 million people that voted on the 13,500 that signed affidavits. We're talking about 99.85% of all Texas voters didn't have any issue at all. Just wanted to make that clear. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Representative Anderson, did you?
Yeah, I did. Because the changes that have been made that Representative Israel pointed out or asked you about, does that make this bill acceptable, okay, to the Fifth Circuit? I think that's what the argument will be. Is that correct?
Well, and we believe it will, but I understand it. We're one of the litigants on one side, and that's why I keep pointing back to the Department of Justice. They've always been in the middle, in between the private plaintiffs and the state of Texas, and they believe that Senate Bill 5, as it's worded now, will cure all of the Fifth Circuit's concerns.
Okay. Then the reason that I ask, I don't want to vote for anything that's discriminatory. I want a bill that ensures ballot box integrity, but doesn't create an undue burden on folks. That's what I want. You mentioned that the impediment affidavit was used roughly 13,000 times.
I think that's correct. I'll defer to SOS on precise number.
13,500.
Do you know what the breakdown, what some of those, the various boxes that were checked, what the breakdowns were?
I think I have a breakdown here. Just over 1,000 said there was disability or illness. 454 said there were family responsibilities.
Okay, do we need to?
So I've heard that 16,280 is the total number of reasonable
Okay,
impediment
Steve,
affidavits that were
I need
cast.
you to come up, since you've already walked up here. Have you signed in to testify?
No, I can do that.
Yeah. Wait, you got to sign in first.
Shall I wait?
Yeah. Can you just hold off for a second?
I have some questions that
I
he
know.
might be able to answer while we're waiting on that.
That's fine.
I've got all day.
Okay. Do you have answers?
I have questions about what they've done thus far.
Oh, okay. Hold on. Are you want to take a vote?
That's fine. That's fine. I've got a couple more questions,
Okay.
but I'll defer
All right.
to.
So, and I know you have some questions, Ron.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to let the committee members ask the questions first, Chairman Chia. So, Rep. Israel?
How many convictions in the last 12 years have there been of in-person voter fraud in Texas?
I don't know the answer to that question. We can research that. But again, because of the diffuse nature of prosecutions in Texas, you've got federal prosecutions, OAG prosecutions, and local prosecutors. There's no one clearinghouse that gathers and aggregates all of that data.
Hey,
Hi, she gave me the chair.
what are you doing here?
She gave me the chair. Do you have any other questions?
I'm okay for now.
Okay.
I think this guy might.
Okay, we're gonna wait. Okay. It's gonna be in holding pattern, ladies and gentlemen, for a moment.
Who called timeout?
Yeah, a little TO. Yeah. All right. Chair calls Steve Peer.
Mr. Chairman, member Steve Peer from the Office of Attorney General as a resource.
Back to, I'm sorry,
Representative
Anderson. I get to go back. We were asking about the breakdown amongst the boxes checked. Do y'all have a breakdown of the boxes that were checked? Did you start 1,000 with disability, 454 family issues, and what else we have?
So 913 said lack of birth certificate or other documentation.
Okay.
1,133 said lack of transportation.
Okay.
3,961 said lost or stolen identification.
Okay.
831 said photo ID was applied for but not received.
Okay.
1,718 said work schedule was the impediment.
Okay.
And then 5,820 checked the other box.
Wow. Okay. So what were some of the reasons given under that other box?
Snowbird. In a tax ratification election, fascist legislature or fascist laws was somewhat popular. There were other reasons, like the heart transplant one that we mentioned earlier. So we can work on a breakdown, perhaps, of the reasons in the other box.
Okay, because the other, that's a lot.
And a substantial number, going back to Chair Israel's question earlier, could have checked another one of these boxes, like transportation, or could have used the provisional ballot because they hadn't lost their ID, but they didn't have it with them. And so it's not that you're leaving these folks who checked the other box without the ability to vote in a future election. You're guiding them towards a box that has a definite, discrete reason for the impediment.
Okay, and so, but these folks were allowed to vote, correct?
They were allowed to vote. That's correct.
And they should have been, I would assume, correct? Or do we know?
Well, like Snowbird, I'm not sure what the true reason that they could not obtain an ID was. And so you would be asking them to check one of the boxes that's a true reason, like the work schedule or illness or sickness.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to ask a couple of questions.
Go ahead.
All right, so do other states have this?
There are other states that have voter ID laws that have an affidavit procedure, and this specific one, the court predicated on the North Carolina affidavit.
Okay, so this bill is substantially similar to other state laws that have stood up to the challenges?
In North Carolina, there was a separate reason why the Fourth Circuit invalidated their law. It was because of evidence that the legislature had in their possession of the disparate effect on minorities. That was separate and apart from the affidavit procedure in Indiana and North Carolina. That was the pattern for the judge's interim remedy here.
Okay, so help me understand the offense that comes from purposely lying on the impediment affidavit. Isn't a third-degree felony greater than the punishment for perjury?
So, let me start back and explain the different penalties that are at work in this area. And
I'm not a lawyer, so.
I pretend to be one during the day. So it basically goes from perjury, which is a Class A misdemeanor, up to illegal voting, which is a second-degree felony. And when you look at the different punishments that are in this range, you can see why the legislature set up the penal code the way it has. For perjury, if Steve and I were to lie to each other, lying to a private citizen, that's perjury. It's a Class A misdemeanor. But the legislature has treated it worse when you're lying to your government. And so that's false statement in a government document or tampering with a government document. And when you lie to your government with intent to deceive the government, that's a state jail felony under the penal code. And so it's worse to lie to your government than it is to lie to a private citizen. We see from the penal code and elections code that it's worse to lie in the realm of voting and to vote illegally than it is for a typical statement that's false to the government. And that's where you have illegal voting come in with a second-degree felony. And this splits the difference between state jail, a general lie to the government, with illegal voting, which is the second-degree felony, and ratchets it back to a third-degree felony right in the middle between those two pre-existing crimes.
So who would get caught up in this kind of prosecution?
Well, and so that's a good question. If, for example, you walked in with your ID in your pocket and then you said it was lost or stolen, then you are knowingly making a false statement to the government. And so that could qualify for this offense. It would have to be a clear case because of the intentional standard there. The prosecutor would still have to prove that you had the ID, you had possession of it, and you intentionally lied to the government to be able to vote through that affidavit procedure when you were already allowed to vote by pulling your ID out of your pocket.
So it's a pretty high standard.
It's a difficult standard. Intentional is the most difficult standard to meet as a prosecutor.
Okay. So why is the implementation date of this bill so late?
It's to allow time for the Secretary of State's office and local county election officials to understand the implications of this law and make sure that the changes are disseminated to the voters so that they fully understand the law before it takes effect.
Okay. So there was a news story about what is being done about educating the voters. And have there been a lot of changes to this bill, and how are we letting folks know?
So this bill is
not... There was
not...
a lot of confusion during the election.
Sure. This bill is not significantly different than than the interim remedy that was in place for November. There were $2.5 million in funds that were allocated to the Secretary of State's office to disseminate the message on what this change to the interim remedy was, and they used those funds leading up to the November election. The budgeting process is different than this bill, and so those funds could be replenished. We're not sure how much, but that's part of the separate budgeting process. And so the goal would be to inform everyone of the changes this would make to the interim remedy process so that everyone knew how they could go about voting, what ID they would need to show up with on Election Day.
Okay. Vice Chair Israel.
I guess I disagree that there to me, when I read it, there is significant differences between the interim order and this bill in that, and part of why I'm having a hard time with this is because the felony language against somebody who's trying to vote their own ballot. They're not impersonating somebody. They're not doing anything to cause harm. They are who they say they are, and they're trying to vote and cast their vote. And for us, I feel as though if a judge were to look at this, and in good faith, if we really wanted to say we want to adhere to the judge's order, then just implement the interim order. What was a 4-year allowance for IDs is now a 2-year allowance for IDs. The punitive language around felony, when last week we heard in this committee the overwhelming reasons, if there is voter fraud, is not because someone impersonated somebody else. It's because of, we talked about, mail-in ballots and the problems that exist around the mechanics of mail-in ballots. So in that sense, I'm having a hard time understanding why, at a time when we want to encourage more people to use their right to vote, that we are being so punitive for individuals who are that voter and are exercising their right to vote when the judge has given us guidance.
Well, I think the guidance that's most important is the Fifth Circuit's guidance. And one of the things they said in their full court opinion was that it's up to the legislature, not the court, the district court fashioning an interim remedy to make the permanent change to the voter ID statute. And so no matter what the district court said as an interim remedy, that could not be what's controlling for the future. And so the question is, what does this body want to do with both broadening the right to vote while ensuring ballot integrity? And Senate Bill 5 and this bill is what the legislature is attempting to do just there. I would push back on the notion that it's just an attempt to scare individuals, because if you look at the very first part of the bill, it's mobile EIC units. It's figuring out where individuals are who don't have their EIC and going to them to make sure that they can obtain it. So this bill does a number of things to address the problem holistically.
Well, and we pardon me.
I'm done.
Sure. Well, and that was a question I asked earlier. The standard is very high on the intent to prove.
That's correct. It would be, if someone checked that a work schedule precludes them from going, it would be difficult as a prosecutor to go after anyone unless they had a part-time job, right? Worked 5 hours a week. Well, your work schedule is probably not precluding you there. If it's a case that's different than that, it's going to be very difficult to prove. If someone works 40 hours a week as a prosecutor, how do you prove that they intentionally lied to the government?
How would you do that?
You couldn't, and so you wouldn't bring that case as a prosecutor given the limited resources that we have. This bill wouldn't fund us with additional resources, and so we would have to know it's a clear enough case to actually go after that person and secure a conviction.
And would the case come to you, to the Secretary of State?
It could. It could also go through the local prosecutors, or it could also be a federal prosecution as well. All three different levels could address the issue.
Okay. Rev. Reynolds?
Thank you. And I had a few questions for clarification. And I just kind of summarized and read the opinion fairly quickly, but the opinion that came out today, the Fifth Circuit en banc made the conclusion that the Texas voter ID law was passed with discriminatory purpose that had a discriminatory effect among African Americans and Latinos. Is that correct?
No, you said it's the Fifth Circuit en banc that said that, and this was the district court ruling that issued the 10-page order today.
Okay, so the
that
district
found
court
a discriminatory purpose. It did not address effect at all.
Okay, so what I see here, then, it says that it entered April 10th, 2017, which is today. After an en banc review of the record, in this case, the Fifth Circuit majority held that there was sufficient evidence to sustain a conclusion that the Texas voter photo identification bill, SB 14, was passed with a discriminatory purpose, despite its proponents' assertions that it was necessary to combat voter fraud. Am I reading that correctly?
So the Fifth Circuit found that there was some evidence of discriminatory purpose and remanded to the district court for it to make the determination that it just made today.
Correct. And that court held that, it affirmed that, correct?
It hasn't gone up yet. It just issued today, and so we have yet to appeal that ruling.
Right, but the ruling was that there was discrimination. Is that correct? I mean, I think I'm reading this correctly.
So the ruling was that there was some evidence.
There was some evidence
of discriminatory purpose, but that the district court also included evidence in its review that was impermissible.
Okay.
And so it remanded for the district court to not look at things that happened in Waller County at the turn of the century to inform its view of what the legislature did here.
Okay.
In Senate Bill 14.
And because it's my understanding that the July 2016 Fifth Circuit, they did find that SB 14 had a disproportionate impact among African Americans and Latinos' political participation and violation of the Voting Rights Act. That's correct?
That's correct. So they ruled on the effect claim, and this would be the permanent solution to the effect claim.
Okay, and then the Fifth Circuit asked the U.S. District Court for an interim remedy, and then that's where they asked the Texas to work with the plaintiffs to create alternatives to the photo ID requirement, correct?
And that was the result of the affidavit procedure as part of the interim order.
Right. And with that, it's my understanding, and we know that based upon the acceptable forms of identification, that no new forms of voter ID were made available, right? Photo voter ID.
That's correct. The district court didn't order any new form of photo ID to be included.
Right. So there's no, for example, no college ID being acceptable form of identification.
Under the interim order, that is correct.
Okay. And it's my understanding from the records that about 600,000 Texans, or about 4.5% of the registered voter in Texas, did not have the photo ID required by SB 14 to vote. Is that correct?
That would be a list we vigorously dispute. That was the starting point of the plaintiffs. What the Fifth Circuit addressed of problems they perceived was a handful of individuals in situations like where they were born in Louisiana or Mississippi, and they would have difficulty going and getting their birth certificate to come back and get the free election identification certificate. So the Fifth Circuit didn't find that there were 600,000 people who were disenfranchised. They went through, and they were mostly plaintiffs in the lawsuit that they discussed their situation with transportation or birth certificate and those specific issues. Every one of the situations that they outlined in the Fifth Circuit opinion, those individuals could vote by this reasonable impediment affidavit that's in Senate Bill 5.
Okay. Now, is it true that more than 80 counties in Texas lack a DPS facility to process the identification card request?
I'm not aware. We'll have to ask DPS that question.
Now, I know Representative Israel asked about the expiration. It was my understanding in the interim, when they were trying to work out a compromise so that they could have it in time for the election in November 16th, the presidential election, that they allow for 4 years of an expiration, and this bill goes back to 2 years. Is that correct?
It splits it. For those who are 70 and older, you can use
for 70 and older, I'm talking about, right.
Correct. So it makes an attenuated adjustment there. For 70 and older, 10-year expired ID, fine. If you're 70 or younger, then it's 2 years. And if it's more than 2 years, you can still vote a regular ballot. You just use that ID to write in the affidavit and then cast a regular ballot.
Why not go with the 4 years for the less than 70 as opposed to the 2?
Because the Fifth Circuit said that it's up to this body to craft the permanent fix, and it doesn't matter what a district judge thinks is an appropriate interim remedy. It matters how you balance broadening access to vote with voter integrity.
And was that input from the plaintiffs?
Well, it was plaintiffs discussing with the Department of Justice and the Attorney General's office and the court.
What I'm getting at is, did the plaintiffs agree that the parties agree that the 4 year was okay, or that they say the 2 year was fine with them?
I don't recall the specific negotiation point on that.
Okay. And if, in fact, Texas is found to have intentionally discriminated against minority voters, could that pull us back into pre-clearance under the Voting Rights Act?
It's possible. It's our belief that you have to have multiple instances of discriminatory purpose in order to be bailed into preclearance. But that's something that there's not much case law on, because most of preclearance occurred before the Shelby County case with the U.S. Supreme Court, where they invalidated the automatic preclearance. And now with the bail-in, we're just now seeing City of Pasadena start going through a bail-in proceeding, and we have yet to hear from the Fifth Circuit exactly what it takes to get bailed in. But intentional discriminatory purpose is a predicate to bail-in.
But just so those who don't follow this stuff that are maybe looking in, it wouldn't be in Texas's best interest to go under that preclearance, would it? We don't want that. In other words, that's not something that Texas is looking to do.
Well, I would assume that you would want your laws to take effect.
Right.
And under preclearance, they don't automatically take effect.
Right. It's a delay, correct? There's another mechanism, another hurdles that you have to go to.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to get to you, Chairman Shia. Okay, so, we've had this court ruling that literally happened while we're sitting here on the dais. And so her ruling is still based on the previous legislation.
That's correct.
Which is why we're trying to do this today, to work under the guidelines.
It's our belief that if you pass Senate Bill 5, that the Fifth Circuit would consider Senate Bill 14 and Senate Bill 5 together to assess whether or not the legislature had a discriminatory purpose.
Okay. And what is in the legislation here that we are considering is what we basically did during the interim.
Correct. It broadens access
during the
to
last
voting.
election from the court ruling.
It broadens access to voting in a way that would encompass every example that the Fifth Circuit found concerning. That's
Okay.
correct.
And, when you talk about the 2 years, it went from 60 days to 2 years.
That's correct.
Okay. Are there any other questions, members? All right.
Just one last thing.
Reynolds.
And I read it at the end of the conclusion of the court's opinion that they are in fact deferring to the legislature, and in fact they are withholding their final decision based upon what we do, and then they'll hear the evidence in June. Is that correct? That's what I read?
That's correct. The court's only going to consider that for the discriminatory effect claim. In other words, she's going to see if there are other examples out there of individuals who can't vote if Senate Bill 5 is passed.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Okay. Chairman Shia.
Thank you, Madam
You're
Chair.
on.
I appreciate you allowing me to attend. I wanted to walk through the bill with you a little bit, and but before I do that, I wanted to get your sense as to intent. You opined earlier as to what the intent was of the bill. Can you refresh my memory on that? The intent of the bill?
The intent of the bill is to balance broadening access to voting to encompass the examples and similar situations that the Fifth Circuit found to be problematic while ensuring ballot integrity.
Does the bill address the district court's discriminatory effect ruling, or exclusively the Fifth Circuit's?
I believe it does encompass the district court's findings as well. The district court's findings were referenced by the Fifth Circuit, and so we went back and looked at all of the examples that the district court found to be problematic, and we couldn't find an example that wouldn't be able to vote under Senate Bill 5 if passed.
Okay. And that spoke only, or your analysis only related to the question of discriminatory effect that was found by the district court and then affirmed by the Fifth Circuit, correct?
Yes, but it's our belief that Senate Bill 5 would also cure any notions of discriminatory purpose as well.
Okay. And now we have a finding of discriminatory purpose, do we not?
That's correct. That didn't factor in the passage of Senate Bill 5.
So just by way of recap, we now have both a finding of discriminatory effect and, as of this afternoon, a finding of discriminatory intent, correct?
A finding of discriminatory intent that has not yet been tested on appeal.
Okay. But by the district court, right? Which
That's
is
correct.
Where we are so far.
That's correct.
So with respect to the rationale of the law, if the Fifth Circuit Court sought to incorporate the findings of the district court, and it's my understanding that with one small exception, they accepted virtually all the findings of fact. In one notable exception, I think it is actually included here as well. With one exception, they accepted all of the findings of fact of the district court. Is that right?
I believe that's correct.
And it's noted in footnote 5 of the order that we received today, correct?
I don't have it in front of me. It came out while I was in the hearing.
Got it. What is the policy rationale from including provisions that would be more stringent in SB 5 than the interim order?
I don't believe that's the inquiry that the Fifth Circuit called us to undertake. So the question is, what are you doing in comparison to Senate Bill 14? And this is adding an affidavit procedure, allowing for mobile voting, and also extending the time for expired IDs.
Okay. And so the interim order, it is your belief that the interim order by the Corpus Christi District Court should have no bearing on the legislature's analysis of the SB 5?
That's correct. It has no legal bearing.
Okay. And so despite the fact that fact-finding occurred by the district court, despite the fact that there was a finding of discriminatory intent, the fact that there was a finding of discriminatory effect, in your view, should not inform this this policy-making body?
A finding of effect does inform it. The interim remedy does not box in the legislature with its sovereign right to determine the permanent remedy.
So even if SB 5 passed as filed, does the district court maintain jurisdiction?
District court
over this
does
case?
Maintain jurisdiction to assess discriminatory effect.
So the district court does matter should matter to the legislature, since they maintain jurisdiction.
Pardon me, Chairman Chia, and I know SB 5, this is like SB 5, but I want to make sure we all know we're talking about House Bill 2481.
Okay. He was testifying earlier on SB 5, so I thought that's what we were talking about.
I apologize. The language that I've been drawing from is the Senate Bill 5 language, which is the same as
it
the bill
is the
that we're
same,
discussing.
but the bill that we're talking about
Correct.
today is House Bill 2841.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
I'm sorry, 2481. Pardon me. Y'all have that for the record? 20. Please, I'm dyslexic right now.
So with respect to House Bill 2481, is the language identical to that of SB 5?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay.
According to, yes, it is. It is identical to SB 5 as it was engrossed. Yes.
So with respect to any policy decisions that we may be making vis-a-vis House Bill 2481, should we not pay attention to the district court's ruling in light of the fact that the Corpus Christi District Court and Judge Ramos still have jurisdiction over this case?
I think what you should pay attention to is the Fifth Circuit ruling on which particular individuals were disenfranchised by Senate Bill 14.
You mentioned
some of those were also found in the district court's order, and we have accounted for all of those, I believe, in House Bill 2481.
You did say something earlier in response to another question, and that was, it doesn't matter what the district judge said. Do you believe that?
I believe if you look in context, we're talking about in differentiating the interim order with the previous findings of those who were not entitled to vote but should have been allowed to vote. Those are two very different things. And so the Fifth Circuit has said that no matter what the interim order from the judge looks like, that doesn't bind or inform the legislature as to their future path on the permanent remedy. So when I say their order is not binding, it's the order, not the findings of the individual voters.
Earlier you were testifying with respect, you were conflating sort of the people who signed affidavits with people who were possibly voting illegally. When you went through that list of 13,500 or roughly, how many of those people voted illegally?
We don't know yet. Again, we're not a central clearinghouse. We don't have federal law enforcement prosecution authority. We don't have the local law enforcement data that they have. And it's early on in the process of referrals from the Secretary of State's office of that data that we're getting from the November elections.
But you conflated the two concepts, right? You talked, when in reference to the reasonable impediment, in response to a question about reasonable impediment, you talked about illegal voting. Is there one case of illegal voting? Are there two cases? Are there 5 cases that you all been able to uncover in those 13,500?
I'm not aware of any prosecutor in the state who's received a final conviction on the November election.
Has there been a complaint of illegal voting?
That is confidential information.
That cannot be confidential information because the Secretary of State has that information and it's available to the public.
Secretary of State has information, but it's made confidential under the election code.
Have they made any referrals to the Attorney General's office related to illegal voting?
We can provide you a limited subset of information that we can waive privilege on at the Attorney General's office. In the hands of the Secretary of State, it's confidential. At the Attorney General's office, it is privileged.
Have you received any referrals from the Secretary of State's office?
We can provide you under Section 552008 of the Government Code a legislative access request.
So that information has always been made public if you have received. I've requested from the Attorney General's office during the tenure of Governor Abbott information related to these investigations, including categories of illegal voting that may have been alleged. And you're telling me that that is privileged information.
It absolutely is privileged law enforcement information under 552108 of the Government Code. We have the ability to waive that privilege on request, which is why we are able to work with members of the legislature and come up with a confidentiality agreement.
Okay. In the past, I have not had to sign a confidentiality agreement to receive that information. Why is that changed?
You're asking me to speak for prior administrations, and I can't do that.
Were you in the Attorney General's office under then Attorney General Abbott?
I was not making these decisions. I served in the former administration, but not in the current role that I'm in.
Okay. Let's walk through a couple of more concepts. Do you believe that House Bill 2481 cures the discriminatory effect of Senate Bill 14?
Yes.
Okay. And can you walk through the ways in which it does that? Again, if you can repeat that. I know you've talked about a few of the mechanisms in the law already, but if you could rehash those for me.
I can. So every example that the Fifth Circuit discussed and every example we found from the district court's opinion could be cured by the reasonable impediment affidavit if an individual checked the box that they lacked a birth certificate or other supporting identification or transportation. Those were the 2 boxes out of the 6, I believe, that are in House Bill 2481 that would have covered every one of those scenarios.
And since we're not bound by the district court's ruling, why don't we have a more simplified affidavit mechanism? Something as simple as, I'm on the voter rolls, I have alternative ID, I am who I say I am, I should vote a regular ballot.
That's a policy question that's left to you, not to me.
Do you think that would comply with the Fifth Circuit's, a regime like that would comply with the Fifth Circuit's guidance?
We could work with you to map out what your language looks like and then run it through the list of individuals that the Fifth Circuit was concerned about to see if it would result in a fix.
So why are we, so I understand that there's a universe that they identified. Could there be a universe of individuals that might be impacted by the discriminatory effect of SB 14 that were not identified by the Fifth Circuit?
That's always possible. And so someone could always bring a new discriminatory effect claim. Here we have the advantage of having seen a number of election cycles that we went through. And so there was plenty of evidence for them to build a case, which is the opposite of the Indiana case, Crawford, where it was a pre-implementation of the law challenge, where you could only do a facial challenge because you hadn't seen the law work in practice.
Mm-hmm.
So we've seen this work in practice for quite some time, and so they've had the opportunity to build a number of cases.
Is the new finding of discriminatory intent, does that change your analysis at all, or the advice that you'd give legislators about SB 5?
It doesn't. We believe that the Fifth Circuit on appeal will consider the passage of HB 2481 or Senate Bill 5.
Do you think that the passage, is it your opinion that the passage of SB 5 moots out claims of intentional discrimination, or would be a remedy for that?
I just want to make sure that there aren't any problems talking about SB 5. because
Sorry.
we really need to stick
House
to
Bill, if House Bill,
24
thank you, Madam Chair.
Yeah, 2481.
If House Bill 2481
Which is a lot like,
passes, which as you represent,
Yeah.
Madam Chair, is identical. If House Bill 2481 passes, do you believe that that moots out the intentional discrimination claim that the plaintiffs won on today in the district court?
We do.
And why is that?
Well, there's no longer a case or controversy. So then the question would be whether the finding from today would be a predicate that could lead towards bail-in. So that
Okay.
would be a separate question, but the actual lawsuit, the case or controversy out there, we believe would be mooted.
I want to understand that a little bit better. So if we're playing basketball and it's my intent to punch you in the face during the game, and I punch you in the face, then later on you and I become best friends. We go play basketball every day together and we're really, really close and we have a completely different relationship. Was my intent at the time I punched you in the face to punch you in the face?
Well, it's an interesting question. It's 22 years to the day since Nolan Ryan did that to Robin Ventura. So, great question.
So how would our current relationship or any remedy? I gave you a bouquet of flowers. I gave you a new basketball. I apologized. Our relationship is completely different than it was back when I punched you in the face on the basketball court. How does our current relationship inform what my intent was when I hit you?
That's a great question, and I think the Fifth Circuit already answered it.
Okay.
When they were talking about past discrimination as evidence of these factors on purposeful discrimination, they looked at this body's acts back starting with 1975. And so they look at the good and the bad together. And here, this is another version of voter ID. It's changing the actual language that was in Senate Bill 14, and it's much more closely aligned in time to 2011 than the acts that the Fifth Circuit was looking at in 1975. So I believe it's not a one-way street. You don't just look at things that you think would bail somebody in dating back to 1975 and not look at how they changed the exact law that's at issue in the lawsuit.
So the court found that the 2011 legislature acted with discriminatory purpose, correct? The district court.
District court, that's correct.
Found that the 2011 legislature passed a photo ID bill with discriminatory purpose, correct?
That's correct. That's what it found.
So how can the 2017 legislature act in a way that would invalidate the discriminatory effect, the punching in the face back in 2011? How is that possible? That we in enacting House Bill 2481 could invalidate the intent that the 2011 legislature had, that the district court has found, with different members, with different committees, different committee composition, different bills. How is that possible?
Well, that's a great argument for why perhaps 1975 and forward acts from the legislature shouldn't be considered as well. But they do. They consider it. That's what the Fifth Circuit has already told us. So the actions today inform 2011, I would argue more so than what the legislature did in 1975 on a completely different piece of legislation. Those are the rules that the Fifth Circuit gave us, so I can't tell you why they gave us that. That would be me trying to infer their intent, and I can't infer anybody's intent. But that's the groundwork that they've laid out.
All right. Expired IDs. Let's talk a little bit about that. Where in the bill do you find the language related to the expiration period of photo ID? And I'm talking about House Bill 2481.
Sure. I don't have the committee sub. Do we have a copy of the committee sub that I could borrow?
Yes, hang on. If you don't have that in front of you, I will give that to you right here. Okay. All right. Here's the bill, here's the pages.
Pardon, Chairman, the question was expired ID. Where is that in the bill?
Yeah, please.
Are we talking about expired ID for 70 years or older? Or are we
No,
talking about
for
60
everybody
days?
else.
For everyone else? It's page 5,
Okay.
section 5.
And if you have a valid government-issued ID that identifies you, excuse me, you have an ID that identifies you and it is 61 days. It expired 61 days ago under Judge Ramos's interim order and the election that was just conducted. Could that person have voted?
That's correct, because the interim order was a 4-year period.
Okay. And under House Bill 2481, if your ID is expired for 61 days, would you be able to vote irregular ballot?
Yes.
Okay. And what would you be able to avail yourself of in order to do so?
You don't have to use the affidavit. You can simply show your ID that's expired 2 years or less ago.
2 years or less. So under House Bill 2481, if you are if you are at 25 months of expiry, are you able to vote under House Bill 2481?
Yes.
Okay. At what point does the at what point does the documentation not expire? Because I'm looking at 60 days in all of these cases. I'm looking at page 5, line 2, line 3. I'm looking at line 7, and they all say 60 days. I'm looking at page 4, line 23. I'm looking at page.
Okay, are you looking at the original bill?
Possibly.
You
possibly.
are. You're not
Okay.
looking at the substitute.
So the substitute is different than the original bill.
That's correct.
In that way, and so
there's room at the podium if you want to join me.
So let me ask you, in the committee substitute, then you have brought the expiry language to, or the author has brought the expiry language to what period?
To 2 years.
2 years. Okay.
As the default rule for those who are under 70 years of age.
For under 70 years. In the interim order, it was 4 years.
That's correct.
Okay, that's an important
And you can
difference.
still cast a ballot through the reasonable impediment affidavit process for anything that's expired over 2 years.
Let's talk a little bit about the new criminal offense for a false reasonable impediment affidavit. I think you spoke earlier about why you thought perjury was not enough, or what the theory was about creating I think you said a middle ground on this new form of perjury. But is this a new category for perjury that is being created here for the first time?
New category for perjury. This is not a perjury-based offense. It's a unique offense in the election code.
Okay, so
Otherwise, it would be
it's a unique
false
criminal
statement in a government document,
Okay.
which has a number of different penalties that are difficult for members of the public to understand what they would be punished for.
So this is I'm glad you explained that. This is not a new form of perjury, rather it is a new criminal offense.
That's correct.
In the law. And can you articulate again why regular perjury was not enough?
Well, because in regular perjury, it's private citizen to private citizen. If you lie to your government, then it goes under tampering with a governmental record. But those don't contemplate election records necessarily. And so this is a new election record that could be prosecuted under that old offense. But elections seem to have higher penalties because one false vote can cancel out another person's constitutional right to vote.
But was there any analysis done on deterrent effect or possibly chilling effect? I mean, you've suggested that you created this new offense because existing perjury claim or tampering with public records or lying to a government entity didn't capture this instance, right? And why wouldn't a simple perjury equivalent have sufficed here?
Because lying in any governmental record subjects you to greater penalties than perjury.
Okay. And but what speak to the deterrent effect. Was there an analysis that you all did that, hey, this has the requisite deterrent effect and this does not?
No.
Okay. Okay. What is the mens rea?
Mens rea is intentional, to intentionally make a false statement in the affidavit procedure.
Explain the difference to us between intentional and knowingly.
Sure. Well, there's negligent, which is you should have known but you didn't, and then knowingly, you know what you're doing but you might not intend the effect. And intentional is the highest state of mind. You have to know what you're doing and intend the effect.
So higher than knowingly.
Correct.
What's the mens rea for perjury?
I don't have the perjury statute in front of me.
I think it's intent to deceive with knowledge of the statement's meaning.
I know that's what the state jail felony is in tampering with a government record.
As well?
It's knowledge of the falsity with intent to deceive.
Okay. Can you take a look at the perjury statute? Not right now,
Sure.
obviously, and see if there's a different mens rea there?
Yes.
Okay. And if it is the case for both tampering with the government record and for perjury, why would we have a different standard for this new criminal offense?
If it's the same or a different intent standard.
So let me ask that question: Is this a different mens rea than?
It's the highest mens rea possible. So I'm not sure what it is with perjury. For false statement, you have to knowingly make a false statement.
How would you distinguish knowingly from intent to deceive with knowledge of the statement's meaning?
Well, it's my understanding that they would both operate similarly, but from my earlier discussion, the key difference is the context in which you're making the knowingly false statement with the intent to deceive. It's not the garden variety false statement in a government document. It's going to elections, which are more sacred in the eyes of the penal code and the election code.
So you believe that they would be that those two standards are virtually identical?
This is the highest standard you could have, and I think that the standard in false statement in government document is almost as high.
So, have you looked at maybe we can ask the Secretary of State's office to come up if they're here, but has the Attorney General's office looked at the list of that 13,500 at all? Have y'all examined that list? Tried to study it for certain racial or ethnic categories? I know you had statistics on boxes that were checked. Have you done any further analysis on that?
We haven't looked at racial or ethnic categories. What we did look at is looking at the reasons that they voted by the other box and seeing what other predetermined boxes they could check.
Did you determine whether anybody lied on that? Has there been a determination whether any of those 13,500 people have lied?
I think it's difficult to determine that on the face of the affidavit. For example, if someone checks transportation as an issue, unless we went out and proactively checked if they had a car registered in their name, and we haven't done that. We're not sitting around looking for things to do exactly.
And you didn't testify, and you were unable to testify as to whether any of those people voted illegally?
It's possible that we have referrals on those impediment affidavits, but again, we need to discuss that further. We need to look further and see if the pending cases that we have were from the November that resulted in an impediment affidavit being cast.
Okay. Well, I'd like that information if possible. Thanks. That's all I've got for now.
Okay. Sure, Israel.
Lawyers first.
I just had a quick question. I think so. We're all clear. I mean, the reason that we implemented the Texas voter ID law was to combat voter fraud, correct?
That was the purpose of the voter ID law,
right?
Is to prevent voter fraud.
Okay. And are you aware of the study that was done by Arizona State University regarding our elections and voter fraud?
No.
Okay. There was a study that was done looking at Texas voting records from 2000 to 2011, finding only 104 cases of alleged voter fraud in Texas over that decade. Have you heard those statistics or anything remotely?
I'm not aware of that study or their methodology and how they found that information.
And that includes mail fraud among 35.8 million votes cast. Would you have any reason to dispute these figures, or?
I would, because methodology is difficult in this area. So if they were to reach out to each one of the 254 local prosecutors and find out, in addition to the federal government, who won't always tell us what their election prosecutions are, I would be surprised if they could accurately find the total number of election fraud cases. We've been asked, and we can't.
But it's safe to say that it's rare. Wouldn't you agree with that?
I wouldn't say that it's safe to say anything along this category. I'd say it's safe to say that one cannot find an accurate number on the total amount of voter fraud.
Well, it's a rare number of cases being even prosecuted in the state, correct?
I don't know what the total number of cases being prosecuted is.
Okay, but you know that your office doesn't have a whole lot of voter fraud cases currently, correct?
We have more than we can handle.
Well, how many is that? I mean, we're the elections committee. I've
Again,
studied
getting
the
back
issue.
to privilege, so we'll have to talk to you about the number of cases that we do have and the number of referrals we've received.
Okay, and we heard earlier testimony from, and I don't want to confuse the bill, but there's no accommodations in the current bill that we're talking about, House Bill 2481, to accommodate federally acceptable identification for Indian tribes, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And are you aware that there are members of the Indian tribes that believe that they are disenfranchised because there's no accommodation to accept their voter identifications?
I think they would be able to vote by affidavit and mark transportation, work schedule, any number of the predetermined reasons that are impediments under HB 2481.
And this is something I get from constituents when I visit a college campus, and I never really been able to articulate it. How can we in Texas accept, for example, a concealed handgun license, but we won't accept a state-issued college ID?
Because there's a uniform standard of issuance for the concealed handgun license. It's one state entity that checks your address and all these other factors that go in. And with campus IDs, it varies even within different constituent campuses of one system. And so there's no standard of uniformity for campus IDs or cross-check with your address.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Representative Vice Chair.
Well, to follow up on IDs, the ID isn't to prove that you're a registered voter. The ID is just to say, this is Celia and I'm a student at this and this is my photo.
I think the thing you have in common with all of the list of acceptable forms of ID is that they're government issued and have some sort of tie to your address.
But if my name is on the voter rolls and it's spelled correctly, and I've got a photo ID that says this is who I am, how can I impersonate? I mean, that's me.
I'm not sure that you're getting back to the true genesis of what the list in Senate Bill 14 is about, is that you can't fake the ID, right? Because I could go out and take a picture of someone else, right, and use that to fake an ID that doesn't have an address on it, and then vote their ballot, right? So if there was no tie of the person with a fake ID back to the voter rolls, there's no security check there at the ballot box.
So it's a concern about a fake student ID. That's the concern?
Sure.
Or would it also be that we're now putting the burden on the university to prove citizenship on students, which is what we, are trying to do at the DPS. I mean, you can have a lot of students that
My point is that I didn't get registered with my student ID. I got registered because I filled out a card and gave all of the appropriate data. It got matched up, and on the day that I'm voting, I just happened to have my student ID. So, again, this is about encouraging people to, yes, come in and vote. We need you to vote. We need you here. If I don't happen to have my driver's license or my passport, the election judge their job is just to say you are who you say you are according to the laws that we're operating under right now. So the student ID doesn't do anything about registering me to vote. I'm registered to vote because I'm on the voter rolls. All it's saying is, yeah, you're Celia, come on in, we need you to vote.
But I think the election judge is using the acceptable forms of SB 14 ID to know that the governmental entity that was taking that picture did their check to make sure that that person is who they say they are. And if it's a poll worker in Harris County who's looking at a UTEP student ID, they don't know what a UTEP student ID looks like. They don't know that they can trust the process that led to the verification of that student being who they are and who they say they are.
Do you think that there's 18-year-olds who get fake IDs from the state of Texas so they can go to a bar on 6th Street right now?
Not legally.
I mean, are you asking me if that's happened before?
Do fake IDs occur?
Do fake IDs occur? I've read the news, and yes, I am aware that they do occur.
Not accusing you of having one when you were in college, but
I had a really
more
good
questions. I know you mentioned this with Sharon Chia, but I'm sorry, I don't understand, and I had a follow-up question about. The bill had the word, well, not the bill, I think under the interim order, we used the word, a person commits an offense if the person knowingly makes a false statement, and now it says intentionally. Would you repeat again what the distinction is, please?
Intentionally is higher and harder to prove for a prosecutor than knowingly. So usually intentionally contemplates that you intend to bring about the effect of your actions.
Intent is harder to prove. You didn't know what was in my mind, so
It is harder to prove.
Harder to get a conviction
Than
on
knowingly,
intent.
that's correct.
Okay. And you mentioned from your perspective, lying to the government in the course of moving this legislation forward is a serious enough offense to create a new crime and call that crime a felony.
I'm simply articulating what the justification would be. Is it my justification? I wasn't the one who made the decision on this. That's the policymakers. So I'm simply articulating from the four corners of the document what we would say we can divine the justification is from that.
Are you aware that our election poll workers are not certified throughout the state of Texas? They're not run through a course of certified training on how to be an elections judge.
I'll defer to the Secretary of State's office on that. I don't train them.
Okay. I think that's all I have for now.
Okay. Chairman Anchia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. More questions about House Bill 2481.
Thank you.
You articulated a concern related to a non-standardization or possible ineffective processes by government entities in the verification of a person who has issued a photo ID, right? You suggested that the state of Texas, their standardization, you're confident with the vetting of that person, and that is why those IDs would be on this list.
You keep saying you as if I'm the policymaker. And
Sure.
I claim to be the legislature.
I'm just.
I could be very efficient if I were the only policymaker.
I'm just sort of repeating what I thought I heard from you.
And I was defining that from the actual list of items in SB 14. Yeah. And when you look for common denominators, it's federal government or state government as a whole that's checking the person to see that they are who they say they are when issuing that photo identification and cross-checking that against an address. So that's the common theme list.
Sure. Is the University of Texas part of state government?
It is part of state government.
Is Texas A&M part of state government?
It is part of state government.
Is the University of Texas at El Paso part of state government?
It is.
Is there any question in your mind about their verification of student identities and their issuance of state IDs?
I haven't studied that. I think the concern that I've heard expressed before is that there's a singular agency with the other identification forms that are issued, like CHL is from DPS, right? And so it's a single point of contact for the state of Texas. If it's UTEP, UNT, UT, then those are all different points of contact, different standards. And so the concern is not necessarily one that they're not conducting their process thoroughly, but when you have so many entities issuing IDs, it's more easy for someone to fake an ID.
It gave rise to a photo ID that I have with me. This is issued by the Texas Department of Public Safety. Could I vote with this ID?
My eyesight after law school has gotten dramatically poor.
So this allows me to get into state buildings. It allows me to get into the state capitol.
It's a security clearance card,
yeah,
not an election identification card.
Yeah, and it's issued by DPS. Director Stephen McCraw's signature is on the back. Is this sufficient?
I don't believe it's on the list of SB 14 approved IDs.
Right. So my general counsel previously had an out-of-state ID, this ID, and a voter registration card, and was not permitted to vote in a prior election because they didn't have a Texas driver's license, a CHL. So your concern is your concern, since you said you were unaware of whether or not UT or UTEP or A&M had rigorous vetting in place. Let me back up. You have no evidence before you that those institutions, those state institutions, state government institutions, have ever issued an ID to someone who said they were not who they were.
I just haven't studied the issue, so I wouldn't know one way or another.
You don't know, right? Have you received any reports that that's the case? Whether
I
you,
haven't.
Whether you've studied it or not, have reports ever come to the Attorney General's office related to that?
As far as the other 199 people, I can't speak for them.
Okay.
I know I haven't.
Has the Attorney General's office ever received reports of fake Texas driver's license?
I believe that would be a local prosecutor offense.
So I served on this committee a couple of sessions ago, and we had DPS come in and bring in all the fake Texas driver's license that, or good cache of Texas driver's license that they pick up, and there were substantial numbers, and I think it was very hard for the committee to distinguish one from the other. This is around the time that we were going to watermarks and everything like that. Do you think it's conceivable that poll workers would have the ability to distinguish a fake driver's license from a real driver's license?
I'm unsure what training they have and how they would understand to differentiate those.
So your concerns about about whether a state government entity like the University of Texas or Texas A&M or UTEP and their rigor in vetting persons versus the Texas DPS, you said there was potentially a qualitative difference between the two, or how do you distinguish between those entities again?
Well, it's the
those entities
legislature.
in state government.
It's the legislature that has. So if you're asking me to defend campus IDs, I'm no expert in campus IDs. All I know that it's not a single source that's using a registration cross-check.
But the rationale, so the rationale you provided earlier was related to the ability of these entities to determine that the person receiving the ID is the person who says they are. You've said today that you're unaware of any cases. You would also stipulate that there are fake Texas driver's licenses out there, right? And
I have heard so in the news, but our office doesn't prosecute
and I don't know if there's anybody from DPS, but I mean, I'm sure they would testify to that fact, or TABC, or someone like that. So let's talk about community college IDs. What's the objection to including those on a list? What would be a rationale for not including those on a list?
I believe it's the same rationale. When you exponentially broaden the number of IDs and the entities who are issuing them, then a poll worker has to accept them, though they're perhaps easily faked, and then there's no cross-check against a registration address on the part of that government entity that's issuing the ID.
Are IDs? It's my understanding that IDs aren't used to verify addresses, but rather simply identity. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
So why is there a concern about the address?
Well, if my colleague Steve Pierre walks into UNT and says, "I'm Steve Pierre, give me a photo ID," and that's all that's required, then there's no documentation that goes to actually confirming that he is who he says he is. And that's actually the piece of the puzzle that this ID is serving at the polls when you take it and vote. I am who I say I am, look at this. But if the university did nothing to actually check that, then how would that be proof that you are who you say you are? It's proof that someone, maybe not even a governmental entity, gave you photographic ID.
So if a university can substantiate how it vets the identity of students and at a bare minimum provides some sort of verification that they are students at that university, their name matches that identity, and that they've provided some sort of ID, does that change your some sort of address, does that change your analysis at all?
Then you have the concern that it's faked from outsiders. Right, and so then the question is, are we going to allow 27 campuses to create their own forms of identification and subject poll workers to that, whereas now you have a list and they know what the IDs on the list look like?
But if the concern is fakes, we know that all of the documents on the primary photo ID list can be faked. We also know that the secondary ID lists are disparate and wide and could be faked. You could fake a phone bill with an address, I think certainly a lot easier than a community college district ID, or at least as easily, or a Texas driver's license. How do you distinguish risk in faking either something on the primary list or the secondary list with the concerns related to faking of a Texas driver's license, a CHL, or some other form? Bless you.
Well, I think the secondary list is much more falsifiable, right? Because the secondary list doesn't necessarily have to have a photograph. It's also more stealable. You could steal a bank statement out of someone else's mailbox. But the question is, if you're looking at the list that's primary ID that can get you in to vote without an affidavit, that's the list that this body has said it's going to be a single point of contact state agency that's issuing or federal agency while confirming address. Has some method to confirm that you are who you say you are.
Okay. Okay. And has the Attorney General's office undertaken a study of whether or not state agencies like the University of Texas, UTEP, A&M, any state institution of higher education, any school district, or any community college district, whether or not any of those entities fails to meet that standard that you articulated?
I think that's like an interim committee charge style question rather than an attorney general question. That wasn't.
But don't you think in an environment where we have intentional discrimination finding and discriminatory effect finding, that would be like one of the first things that we'd look at?
If you're the policy-making body, maybe, but we're not the policy-making body. I mean, you could do that if you wanted to. You could go in a million different directions. So it's
and do you think it would be wise to do that before we passed a bill like this?
I don't think it's necessary. The judge shouldn't even find campus IDs to be necessary in the interim order. No.
Okay, which judge?
Judge Ramos.
And didn't you say earlier that we're not bound by what Judge Ramos says?
Correct. You were saying it was a high standard that we should go to and beyond, and that wasn't a standard she found needed.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Members, are there any more questions? Then Rep. Fallon.
Yes. Well, first, Mr. Pierre, what was the number of affidavits?
16,280.
And I apologize because I cited 13.5, so it's 16.5 roughly.
16,280.
16,280 exactly. Okay.
Is the number that I
so
have.
still
Yes, sir.
pretty much 99.85%. See, my concern with the college ID thing would be, having been a college student for 4 years, we know for a fact that in the state of Texas, the policy has been since 2001, they don't check immigration status for in-state tuition if you graduated Texas high school, correct? I mean, that's the law right now. If you've been in a Texas high school for more than 3 years. So we know for a fact that we have foreign nationals that are here unlawfully that attend our universities. So that's, and anybody can fill out an application for a voter, to vote, but they might not be a citizen of the country. And so if I have a college ID that says I'm from University of Texas, paying in-state tuition, but I'm a foreign national, that doesn't prove that I'm a citizen legally here to vote, whereas there's that higher standard for let's say a driver's license or an ID. Is that correct?
That's correct. There's no citizenship check on campus IDs.
Which is probably would lead to huge concerns over having it as an acceptable form of ID, because it's just not. It doesn't have the same rigor, if you would. So, just wanted to point that out. I was kind of thinking about that when that was coming up.
Okay. Well, and as you said, we're the policymakers, and that was. I mean, when we came up with the IDs, the different forms, the judge was not criticizing that. She was criticizing that if they don't have one of those approved forms, then that's when we put in the impediment to getting one of the forms.
That's correct. And going back to the list of individuals who the Fifth Circuit or the District Court found to be disenfranchised by the law, no one on that list couldn't vote by this exact wording of HB 2481. It solves the entire problem that the court has identified.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Did you have a question? No. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. And just again, because I had stepped out for just a quick second, y'all were testifying on House Bill, I better get it right, 2481.
Indeed.
Yes.
Okay. As substituted.
As substituted.
All right. Okay. Chair calls Glenn Maxey.
Thank you. Glenn Maxey for the Texas Democratic Party, here in opposition to House Bill 2481 as proposed. This bill has been presented as a codification of the federal court's order directing the voter ID requirements for the 2016 election. This characterization, in my opinion, is simply untrue. This bill differs from the court's order in significant ways, which have been discussed already. And that removes any assurances and disqualifies any claims that this bill complies with the federal court order. Within the next few weeks, or after the session, the court will make a final order. And with today's ruling of intentional discrimination, we know that that order will lay out the details of a remedy to correct the discriminatory effect of Senate Bill 14 and to mitigate that discriminatory intent. So it's premature and a misuse of the legislature's time and energy to adopt a voter ID law that is unlikely to meet the legal standards of the federal court that they will establish. One of the things that, as a layman, listening to this discussion today, it seems to me that this legislature, with what's before us and the testimony that happened in the Senate on Senate Bill 5 and now on House Bill 2481, that the proponents or the people who have some heartburn about this solution have laid out that with just a simple few amendments, we could come to consensus and all kumbaya and walk out with a good voter ID bill to assure that there's not impersonation going on and voter fraud going on, and all get to the place where we want to be as a legislature. So we would ask a couple simple amendments that we actually go back to the court order's 4-year expiration date, that we bring the penalty back down to the same as falsifying a government document, that there be an affirmative defense to prosecution for an election worker telling a voter to do this affidavit incorrectly. I will tell you anecdotally, we know that of the 16,000 some odd, a significant number of people filled out those affidavits incorrectly because they were instructed to by the election workers because of the inadequate training that we have out there. And lastly, we believe that a student ID, even a student ID in conjunction with an out-of-state driver's license would help. There's still a group of kids, young people in this state, who are out-of-state students who, no matter how you do this affidavit, are not going to be allowed to vote because they do not have Texas driver's license or Texas IDs because they don't need one because they're not driving while they're here at the university. But when they register to vote in Texas, to vote in a presidential election, they don't have the ID. They're the ones that Representative Anderson was asking about that checked that other box. Significant number of people who had an out-of-state driver's license who could prove who they were. Oh, I'm getting beeped. But they didn't have that. So we would ask that some kind of remedy for out-of-state driver's licenses in conjunction with the student ID would solve that problem for that small group of people.
I have a question. Thank you, Madam Chair. Glenn, because of your years of experience and your work with this committee, one of the things that concerns me is that we have elections judges who are at varying levels of awareness, engagement, commitment to a standard. It could be different from one side of town to the other side of town, the answer that you're going to get. And I don't fault them. They're good and decent people. But could you share with us kind of your thoughts about the fact that we have elections judges who are not always standardized or equipped in the same manner to help a voter through a process that doesn't have the standard ID?
In my experience working with county clerks across the state of Texas, and I've worked with literally, almost all of them over the years in some way. In every election cycle, dealing with election judges and election workers, the standard of training that occurs from county to county is an amazing array. From some counties that have, 5-hour trainings or all-day trainings for their election workers to others who basically say, if you've been an election judge before, here's your materials, go do it. It's that lackadaisical. The training is really, I mean, the Secretary of State has great training manuals. They have great training opportunities, and they train the clerks to go back and train election workers, but how that happens county by county is really pitiful. So when the voter ID bill came into effect, I believe that we have significant, out of some 8,000 precincts across the state, we're talking about probably 25,000 election workers at a minimum in a simple election, statewide election, that there's a significant number of people who never paid attention. Even if they went to the training, they were there just because they were told they had to come in order to be an election judge. So I think to trust that somebody, election workers, knows this law backwards and forwards, and even can look at the kinds of IDs that are in the pictures. There's a significant amount of election judges that have never even looked at that material.
Would you, if I was to look at this bill and, I think in the simplest terms, we could have just looked at what Judge Ramos gave us for the interim and then make that a bill, knowing that passed, that met her standard.
Correct.
But in the case of elections judges who are the biggest problem that I have with this is that we are we're telling voters who are voter X, and voter X is on the roll, but may have gotten some incomplete or inconsistent information from an elections judge, that you can't vote your own ballot, and that's I think that could be an easy fix to this bill. Do you agree?
That's my point exactly. I think that with some simple amendments, a person who's, I have an ID, a driver's license. I'm 64 years old. I've stopped driving, therefore I didn't renew it, and I've gone to vote, and it has expired, and I can't use it because it's expired more than 2 years under this bill. I'm still the person on that picture. I'm still that person. So I don't get it. Why is the expiration date at all an issue?
Well,
it's a state driver's license.
Okay.
It's my picture. What's the expiration have to do with this at all if we're trying to prove identity?
We can change looks. I mean, that's why you have to change passport, because, what I look like now, what I look like 2 years ago, I wish I looked like 2 years ago.
But Madam Chair, even under Senate Bill 14, the training of the Secretary of State is that picture does not have to look exactly like you.
Let me comment.
We had the whole thing about transgender persons, Madam Chair, that a person on a picture on their ID may look like a man, but they're showing up and they look like a woman and don't look like the picture at all. They still get to vote.
They need to get their voter ID or their driver's license updated. But what I want to say is, in this last election, all the ID requirements, that had been worked out with the court to get to this last election, worked fine. No one complained. I mean, you had some plaintiffs that they're going to complain no matter what. And, 13,500, 16,000, I've seen both numbers. But out of almost 9 million people that voted, and it went fine. And no one, was inhibited
respectfully,
from voting.
I would disagree. I think that it didn't go fine. That's why we have an intentional discrimination issue. So the fact that the plaintiffs made this thing was because there were people who were not allowed to vote who should have had the right to vote. And that's what this court case is all about. So we would hope that we would make some fine-tuning amendments and that we could all then agree that we have a voter ID that has what the legislature intended under Senate Bill 14, but it's workable, and we don't leave anybody who has a right to vote without the ability to cast a ballot.
Reynolds.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One Glenn, you've addressed most of the concerns I had with Representative Saya, but I had a few more just anecdotally. Are you aware that prior to the court's ruling that they basically stated that Texas had the most draconian voter ID law in the nation?
Yes. I think many nonpartisan groups that study this, the Brennan Center, all those kind of places looked at this and said we had the most restrictive voter ID bill in the nation.
And in fact, based upon the court's ruling today, that it's the 5th time since 2011 that the federal courts have struck down Texas laws as discriminating against minorities.
That's correct.
And that the amendments that you offer today, you think that they could help cure that, that they're reasonable in nature and that they should be implemented if we're going to have a voter ID law at all?
I think House Bill 2481, as substituted with the few minimal suggestions that a number of people and myself have brought forth in the Senate hearing and here, we're done. We could all walk away with this and have a great bill to know that we have security in our voting.
And that the fear of that if we don't, that the court is going to review what we do in June after the legislature adjourns to assess whether or not, once again, we've implemented another voter ID law that has a discriminatory impact.
I think if she looks at her interim ruling and that we thought was, everybody thought worked well together except a few glitches in the interim thing. I am concerned, as Mr. Anderson questioning about the word other. There are, as I said, a significant number of people who checked that other because the other reasons didn't fit their situation. And if you don't have that, I don't know we're going to be back with people who don't fit the check boxes. And since you're back in the room, I just take 1 second to say a significant number of people that we are aware of were people who were out-of-state students. Let's say a young woman from New York comes to Texas, the University of Texas. She has a New York driver's license, and she doesn't need a Texas driver's license because she doesn't have her car here. So she's using that New York driver's license for her ID for all other purposes, banking, to get on an airplane. But she registered to vote here to vote in the presidential election, but then she ended up without a Texas driver's license because she didn't need one. So that's a person who checked other and said, I don't have this. It's not because I don't have transportation, or it's because I didn't ever need a Texas driver's license.
And I think, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Rep. Anderson.
And I think one of the Attorney General's office was talking earlier that the replacement that most of those that would been other would have fit into one of the other categories. And what you're just saying there is lack of documentation she would fall into that category as opposed to checking other.
Yeah, because right now the only thing is to check that I don't have a birth certificate. It wasn't that I don't need one of the 7. There are people who never got one of the 7 on the primary list because they never have needed a concealed handgun or a driver's license or whatever.
What I wanted to point out was that there is a category that would fit that specific issue right there. Lack of documentation was one of the categories that she put in, that they had put in there.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Chair calls Cindy Weatherby.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Cindy Weatherby, and I'm here testifying on behalf of myself and the League of Women Voters of Texas on HB 2481. I know that each and every one of you on this committee are dedicated to making sure that each Texas citizen who's eligible to vote can do that. I know you agree with us on that, and you're trying to do your best to make sure that happens. We do ask that you consider some of the other suggestions you've heard today, especially the additional IDs, such as the tribal ID that you heard testimony on today, and all the federally governmental issued IDs, Texas governmental issued IDs, and the state university IDs. I know that those last two, all federal issue ID, all state issued IDs and all state university IDs are accepted in Indiana, for example, and they've never had any problem with that. To our knowledge, we know that they've been used, the courts have reviewed that, and they've not been repealed by those states. So the other thing I guess we want to make sure that you understand is our agreement with the possibility for continued confusion. We're out there with the voting public all the time, and we know how confused, several of you mentioned it today. Last fall's election was very confusing for many people. We took phone calls, we talked with people. I'm sure your offices did as well. Back to the student example, a lot of students were confused about how they might be able to use the impediment form if they didn't have a driver's license. And even if you considered putting student IDs on that list of the impediment list, because a lot of students don't have a utility bill or some of the other items that are on the impediment list, that would be an improvement. But we thank you for your patience with people who are all trying to do the right thing to make sure that everyone in this state who is an eligible voter has that opportunity to do so. Thank you.
Okay. Any questions, members? Rep. Reynolds, he has a question for you.
Thank you for being here with the League of Women Voters to offer your testimony today. And it's so, just to summarize, you believe that this bill could, well, first of all, we agree on the premise that every eligible voter should be allowed to vote, so no one should be disenfranchised, correct?
Correct.
And that you believe that the bill as written, House Bill 2481, without the additional provisions that you laid out and that Glenn Maxey laid out, that there could still be some impediments to voting.
There could.
And you believe that if we add those to those, I guess we took up an amendment to add the college ID, the tribal, and increase the expiration to 4 years, that could enhance the bill.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Chair calls out Virginia Parks. Oh, okay. Virginia Parks chooses not to testify, and she is opposed to the bill. Chair calls up Alan Vera.
Alan Vera, this time representing only myself as a native Hispanic Texan and Army Airborne Ranger Vietnam vet, testifying on HB 2481. Back in the spring of 2011, I sat all day in a room for a select House committee to testify on SB 14. I'm going to tell you now what I told them back then. In November of 2010, in the general election, I served as an alternate judge in Harris County Precinct 327, a heavily Democratic and overwhelmingly African American precinct. Within the first 2 hours after the poll opened, I had a voter present herself using a utility bill as her only form of ID. By law, I processed her and let her vote a regular ballot. That was the law. No photo ID. Less than an hour later, another woman with the same name and address presented herself to vote, showing a voter registration card and a valid Texas driver's license. But somebody else had already voted using her name and her address. The voter with the more valid forms of ID was forced to vote a provisional ballot, effectively disenfranchising her. It happened again at my table shortly after noon, and at the other qualification table, letters N through Z, the same thing happened between 3 and 5. So in one single precinct, in one election, we disenfranchised 3 elderly African American women because of lax photo ID laws. That night, at the True the Vote debriefing, we heard the same report over and over again from many of those who'd served as alternate judges. Now, after the photo voter ID law was passed in 2011, I went back to that same precinct as an AJ 4 more times. We never had a single repetition of that incident, not one. We had no more incidents of that type, at least not in any of the precincts where True the Vote workers were present between 2012 and 2014. The current Texas photo voter ID law made a difference. The current Texas photo voter ID law prevented disenfranchisement of elderly minority voters. So here we are in 2017 with HB 2481, and smart lawyers on both sides of the argument and lawyers acting as federal judges have gotten us so messed up that we're right back to turning clock back to 2010. HB 2481 will satisfy some federal judges, maybe not all, but will not prevent the kind of disenfranchisement I've just described. Seems to me that a lot of judges and lawyers are more interested in forcing Texas to appear to protect voting rights of minorities on paper than protecting them in the voting place where they really count. Sorry I don't know about all of this, and you can do what you want with 2481. Any questions?
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Chair calls up Yanis Banks.
There we go. Hey, Giannis Banks, against the 2481 for the Texas NAACP. And so we've heard, I think y'all had a long testimony about the issues with the bill, and then that kind of some of the issues that we have concern with, and in particular is the felony, the enhancement of the criminal penalty. We think that is severe, and we actually believe that it will cause discriminatory intent of people being worried about voting and turning people away from the ballot booth. We think the original criminal intent of what we had in the law was working, it was good, and there was no need to enhance it. That's one of our major concerns with the bill, especially when you look at from what was done with the interim remedy to what's being done now, and that's in HB 2841.
2481.
2481.
I know, I'm with you on that.
It's a long day. We believe that would have such an impact that make affidavit process essentially meaningless. The law already provides a serious penalty as far as misconduct, and the need to have this new intimidating law where it is easy to prosecute an innocent behavior is just, we believe, offensive. We don't need a new penal provision. The law is adequate as is. And of course, we want to see more IDs added. I think you've heard some issues about coming from college students as well as the elderly. I think there are some secure government IDs that we could use that should be added to it. We should be doing things to make sure that folks who want to come out to vote are able to vote, and creating more barriers to do this. And that's something that we believe. We also believe that the original SB 14 wasn't necessary, and we still do. Therefore, we believe that SB 5 isn't necessary because we don't think SB 14 was necessary. We believe that passing this law would not put voters on equal access footing prior to SB 14, and it may not even make SB 14 better by the passing of this law. So, we are definitely strongly against this law, or this bill, HB
2481. Okay. Any questions? Representative Reynolds.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Giannis, I know the Texas NAACP, they were one of the plaintiffs in the lawsuit, voter ID lawsuit, correct?
Yes, sir.
So you're closely familiar with the litigation?
Somewhat, yes, sir.
Okay. And the court ruled that it had a discriminatory intent as it disproportionately affected African Americans' voter participation in violation of the Voting Rights Act, correct?
Yes, sir.
Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, somewhat. I've been trying to read, the order as everybody else have, and even talking to some of the attorneys, including my boss, President Bledsoe, about the order and what it means. But I think it shows that there was some intent. I think there was some evidence in the record that shows that Texas was warned and told about the impact this bill or SB 14 would have on the state, and it kind of ignored that, and that was from the evidence that was put before the courts, and so I think the judge is letting Texas know to be careful of what it's doing, and as you move forward, to be smart with what you're doing. I would say to make sure that you're not doing anything that would discourage or discriminate from people from voting. And I think part of increasing the criminal penalty will do that. And then even keeping it to a limited set of IDs is a concern as well, because I think that played a role into the judge's decision about who have access to these forms of IDs. And I think that's the message that the courts are sending, or that court is sending.
Okay. And when in the interim ruling that the court used for the state of Texas to work with the plaintiffs to come up with some remedies in time for the November 2016 election, was the NAACP at the table?
Yeah, I think the lawyers were involved. They were having conversations about what some things they would like to look for as far as what the interim remedy should look like. You're talking about what the judge came down with, right? So to make sure I'm quick.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think there was conversations between the attorneys. I wasn't a part of those conversations because I let the attorneys do what attorneys do, and I do what they tell me to do. And so they were involved in those conversations about trying to make something at least that would be good for the interim, and then look to see what could be done that would probably be better, but with that short time frame and saying this is what we can agree with, I guess, for the interim for the time being. But I think a lot of the attorneys didn't say that this wasn't enough or this wasn't as good as it could be, but it was something that could be done for that time period we have for the interim.
Okay, so as we look at House Bill 2481 that we're talking about today, is it the Texas NAACP's position that this bill doesn't go far enough in that it doesn't allow for such things as college IDs?
Yeah, I think the lack of college IDs, you can even throw in some of the bill or the conversation earlier about the Native American IDs. I think when you try to enhance the criminal penalty of folks who are just trying to vote their ballot, want to come in and vote their ballot, I think that's a concern and could discourage people or discriminate from people from voting. And so I think we're not going in the right direction. We understand that folks want to make sure ballots are secure and your voting is secure, because I think we all understand that voting is important. And what the turnouts of that can be if you don't have your voice heard. And everybody wants to make sure that their voice is heard, but I think we can do stuff in a smart and fair way.
Are you also concerned that this bill doesn't include the 4-year expiration date that you're eligible to vote, and it decreased it to 2 years?
Yes, sir. We didn't see what the real reason was, and I guess conversations that was had on the other side, the other chamber in the Senate. There wasn't really we think a valid reason to decrease it from decrease it from 4 to 2. We think 4 years was working as it did in the interim, with allowing people to come out and vote and use their expired IDs that still show who they are and represents who they are. We didn't see a problem with that. It was something that worked, and there was no need to change it.
And finally, do you recall where in the court's original opinion that came down, she made the analysis that the Texas voter ID law was similar to a poll tax, amounted to a poll tax?
I do. It's been a while since I've read it, but I do remember that.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Okay, any other questions? Thank you. All right, Chair calls up Selena Moreno. And if I mess that up, please correct me.
You're fine, Chairwoman. My name is Selena Moreno. I'm an attorney with MALDEF here to testify against House Bill 2481. We have 4 main concerns with the bill. Number 1, it does not conform to the interim court order that was agreed to by the plaintiffs, by Governor Abbott, the Secretary of State, the DPS director in the current voter ID case. And there's no reason to think that the court in the current voter ID case would not again include similar provisions into a permanent injunction, especially after today's order that SB 14 was intentionally racially discriminatory. So we think the bill should be amended to include language in the court-ordered remedy that a voter's address on the voter rolls does not have to match the address on her ID. And also, it should be amended to allow voters under age 70 to use an expired ID up to 4 years, as is allowed by the interim remedy. The federal judge just ruled today that SB 14 was also unduly strict, and many categories of acceptable photo IDs that were allowed by other states were admitted here in Texas. For example, SB 14 did not include, as was mentioned,
Okay,
student.
and I want to stay focused on 2481. I mean, I know the judge rules on the old one, but this
Yes,
is
Chairwoman.
trying to.
And I was just going to say that this bill, similarly, like SB 14, does not add public or private college or high school student photo IDs to the list of acceptable IDs, and at the very least to the list of documents that are on that reasonable impediment declaration. And I'll just say, just as a reference point, in 2012, MALDEF represented several organizations and 2 Latina high school students in an intervention to oppose the state's attempt to secure preclearance. And the federal court blocked the law on the grounds that it disproportionately harmed Latino voters. Our 2 high school student clients, who were 18-year-old twins, they had a student ID, they had a social security card, but none of the acceptable photo IDs under SB 14. And so a driver's license, in their case, would have substantially increased car insurance costs for their parents. For the family, it was burdensome to spend all day at DPS to get an election ID certificate with one of their parents working and the other one taking care of grandma full time. And so we need to add student IDs because we should not be suppressing the vote of the very students that we should be encouraging to exercise their right to vote. Number 3, as long as voter ID is required, a reasonable impediment declaration provision is a necessary voter safeguard, but the bill penalizes perjury with a threat to 2 to 10 years in jail, and that effectively undermines the whole declaration process through voter intimidation. And finally, number 4, the ramped up criminal penalty has no safeguard in place. What do I mean by that? It's not paired with an affirmative defense where there's either a mistake of fact or what we saw very, very often in the November 2016 election, when a poll worker provides a voter with incorrect information. As you've heard happen here today, we saw that very clearly in Bexar County, which is why we ended up suing the county and successfully won that case. So I'll just end by saying that House Bill 2481, with these improvements, could strike a more appropriate balance between ensuring, I think what Representative Fallon was talking about earlier, ensuring voter integrity and access to the vote, to the ballot. But without these amendments, we urge the committee to vote against the bill. Thank you.
Okay. Any questions? Vice Chair, pardon me.
Oh, that's okay. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks for your patience tonight. It's obviously an important topic.
Yes, it is.
Ms. Moreno, because of MALDEF's involvement, and you mentioned the 2 young women as an example who couldn't vote, but I think what we see, like Representative Fallon asked about student IDs, they didn't get registered with their student ID. They got registered because they filled out a piece of paper. So they were ineligible to vote because of the photo ID requirements, but they were registered to vote as students. I mean, not students. They were voters of student age who were registered to vote, legally eligible to vote.
That's right.
So, in other words, the student ID wasn't their registration mechanism. The student ID just said these women are who they say they are.
That's right.
Okay. Thank you very much for your testimony and for your engagement.
Yes. Hello, Ms. Marina. How are you?
Hi, how are you doing,
Good,
Representative?
thank you so much. We do have, though, not just driver's licenses for Texas residents. Don't we also have an ID that the state issues that's not a driver's license?
That's right. And in the
Could they have
case
gotten?
of,
Could your were they female or male twins?
they were female twins,
Okay,
and in the
the
case of our
gals.
2 Latino high school students, as I mentioned, it was, they did not have the luxury to wait all day. They had no transportation. They had one working parent and the other one taking care of grandma full-time at home. And so that is why they had neither a driver's license nor a personal ID.
Do you know how far the nearest DPS driver's license office was to them?
I don't recall. I actually wasn't an attorney at MALDEF when this case was being litigated, but I'm not sure.
Do you know what year was that?
I'm sorry?
What year was this? Sorry.
This was in 2012.
Okay.
Okay, and this bill puts into statute that the Secretary of State will set up the mobile registration, or getting the ID, getting an ID.
I understand that. I have not heard a valid argument, though, why a student ID is not only not accepted as an acceptable list of IDs, but also has not even been considered as one of the IDs on the reasonable impediment declaration. It was mentioned earlier that there needs to be a singular entity, and yet a paycheck is not coming from a singular entity. That document is on the list of documents on the reasonable impediment declaration. A utility bill is not coming from a singular entity. That document is also on the list of documents under a reasonable impediment declaration. So I just have not heard a legitimate reason why that would not be included.
But walk me through if in this. And thank you, Madam Chair. In this instance, with the young 18-year-old gals, if now that we have a mobile unit, they could just call the mobile unit and they could come over and they get a free ID.
I'm not familiar with how the mobile units are going to be working, but I think that one of the issues in the bill, what I've heard, is the capacity. Right? We've heard some capacity issues with the Secretary of State's office. What is going to be the capacity? If anybody who calls, are they going to be able to go and respond to all of the calls that they're going to be getting? I think that's an issue that's been brought up.
I believe that there are some other states that have done this and they haven't really had any issues. But you would agree then, if we give a mobile unit and they can handle the calls and do it in a reasonable amount of time, that would mitigate the issue that the two former clients of MALDEF had?
I mean, I think what would mitigate the situation with our clients and with many other Texans is that the state would stop intentionally racially discriminating, as the court continues to find.
So just walk me through it, because I'm a simple guy, right? If they have an issue, they wanted to get driver's license. They wanted to vote, and we want people to vote if you're a citizen. And if they, as you said, that they had a single mom and they were taking care of one of their grandparents, and it was hard for them to get there, they couldn't drive there. So if they could just let the state know, call, and then they could come to their house, to their residence, and provide them with those identifications so they could vote, that would be very helpful, would it not?
I mean, I think that it is, that having a mobile ID, certainly, I wouldn't disagree with you that that's not a step in the right direction. I think the issue is capacity, right? So how many of our two 18-year-old twins are there going to be, right? I think a lot of, as was mentioned, a lot of students don't have the necessary ID under the current statute and also under House Bill 2481.
Good work. Yeah. No, so I think that the only way to know is if we do it, and if there's a capacity issue, we can address that. But it doesn't seem, and the other states that have done this, there have been, because again, if you're talking about 8.9 million voters, and there was 0.14% that had any issue, and most of them were, I lost my ID, they can certainly go and get them. There'd probably be only a fraction of those folks that would need the mobile unit. So I think it could work out.
I mean, I think the mobile unit is not a bad thing, but I also don't see, with the other amendments that I mentioned, for example, making sure that there's no address match requirement, right? Making sure that student IDs are acceptable. I don't think that if one is workable, I'm not understanding why some of these others are also not workable. I'm just not hearing.
Well, the student ID issue for me, as I mentioned before, it's the law of the land that I think the legislature in 2001 bound us to, which was they're not going to ask immigration status of kids that graduate high school in Texas as long as they've been there for 3 years. So you're going to have foreign nationals that attend our universities, even with in-state tuition, that may not be citizens of this country.
I think that's confusing the issue of registration.
No,
and
well,
ID.
that's what I'm saying, though, because, I think I remember you here last session when I gave the example of that nefarious Russian, that guy that comes over and they get that little card and they check that little box that says they're a citizen, and they lie and they weren't really a citizen, and they get their voter ID card. It's a lot harder for that Russian nefarious citizen. I think it's kind of funny now that the Russian thing's in the spotlight so much. It wasn't back then. But that it's harder for them to get an ID than it would, like a driver's license, than it would a college ID, because those, like at UT, if you get in, they're not asking you if you're here legally or not. They don't even ask. They want to know. So we don't know if we can't rely on UT to determine citizenship, nor do we really want to, do we?
I think the issue that Representative Israel mentioned was that you don't get registration. I mean, that's not going to get you registered, right? That's going to be checked when you're actually registering to vote. I don't recall exactly. I think you might be confusing me with my boss, Nina Perales.
It might have been
with the NIF. Yeah, I think y'all somehow I remember a conversation about rainbows and unicorns very vaguely.
Yes, yeah, that was a good one. Yeah. Well, yeah, that's my whole point, though, is you can't legally have a driver's license if you're not here in this country as either a legal resident or a citizen. You're not supposed to have a driver's license, but that isn't the same standard to just have an ID for a college. That this has no bearing whatsoever.
They're not getting registered with that.
I know, but you can check a box and say, I'm registered, and you can lie. So I have this card, this little piece of paper says I'm registered when we don't know if they really are or not, are legal, rather. And then you have something else that we also don't know if they're here legally. We don't know. That's why it's a substandard issue.
I mean, under that argument, wouldn't you say the same thing with the utility bill?
You don't want me to answer that. I'm not a lawyer, though. So, okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh, yeah, Rep. Reynolds.
Very quickly, similar to what I asked Mr. Banks, who was here with the Texas NAACP, MALDEF as an organization represents largely the Latinos across the state, correct?
Yes.
And across the nation.
Across the nation.
Right, it's a nationwide organization.
That's right.
And since the judge in this particular case and the Fifth Circuit has essentially ruled that the Texas voter ID law had a discriminatory impact upon African Americans and Hispanics or Latinos, in your opinion, representing MALDEF today, without the additional provisions that you've articulated today, do you think that House Bill 2481 would still be discriminatory against Latinos?
I do.
Okay. And do you believe, in your opinion, that if this committee would add an amendment that included those additional provisions, that included the additional forms of identification, as well as the affirmative defenses, and the clarifying position to address the address on the ID document is not required to match the address shown on the official list of registered voters, do you believe that we could get to a place where we have a bill that does not discriminate against Latinos and, in fact, and in essence, protects the state from voter fraud? In other words, we're going to have a voter ID law. We want to get a voter ID law that doesn't discriminate against Latinos and African Americans, which the court has said it does. So, in other words, are you giving us provisions that get us to that point?
Yeah, the provisions, Representative, that I've provided, I think, definitely move us towards striking a more appropriate balance between voter integrity and access to the ballot.
And the reason why I asked it that way is because some people, they just say, well, we don't need voter ID, period. Okay, so in other words, we're not here to argue that we're striking voter ID. We're here saying this is how we can make it where it does not discriminate against Latinos, and therefore these are some of the suggestions that you're saying that we need to include within this provision in order to make it valid.
Right.
And is it your concern if we don't add these provisions that when the court revisit this issue in June of this year, that we'll be back at the same place where the court is again striking it down? Is that your opinion?
I don't know what the court will do. It's always for us not a good idea to predict, but I do think that some of the same problems will exist. The Latinos are twice as likely not to have a form of acceptable photo ID, so that would be a problem. I do think that there are some provisions. The Senate amendment that was made, is just not sufficient to get us where we need to be.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Chair calls up Anthony Gutierrez.
Anthony Gutierrez, Common Cause, Texas, testifying against HB 2481. agree with many of the points that have been made by Giannis and Selena. Won't sort of reiterate all of those. I did want to talk about one separate issue that I don't think has been touched on a lot, which in the interim remedy, there was a provision that required the defendants to develop a detailed voter education plan, including timetables. The plan also required like $2.5 million for that. I think this is a huge deal because while we keep talking about the 16,280 people that filled out the reasonable impediment form, there are potentially a lot more people that stayed home just because they were confused about the law. This was something the University of Houston Hobby Center took a look at in the 2014 law and the 2016 law. And, the key point that came away with was confusion over Texas's voter identification requirement potentially discouraged as many as 9% of registered voters from going to the polls in November 2014 elections. This isn't about the law specifically, it's just about the fact that it was ever-changing, continually going through the changes through the court process, through the legislative process. I think a lot of us in this room, if you asked us during specific times during the course of this voter ID, as much as it's been changing, we'd possibly be confused as to which forms of ID were allowed at various times. If you're just sort of an average Texan, I think it's even harder to be keeping up with all this stuff. And this is also a thing, we, Common Cause, were involved with a coalition of groups trying to provide assistance to voters during this 2016 election. There was a hotline, and people could reach out to us via email versus social media. There was a ton of complaints or questions just about common things that are just logistical things, or where do I go vote? But there were an awful lot of people who were confused about this aspect as well. There was the posters that were incorrect that we saw around the state, some election judges and clerks giving out incorrect information. I think it is incredibly important that built into this is there are some specific language that details how a voter education plan would work, that the details of that plan also be public, going back to Representative Rodriguez's bill from earlier. Because there are groups like mine who definitely want to be helpful in this process. We want to be able to help educate people about the details of whatever the final bill looks like. And in order to do that, it'd be really helpful to know what the Secretary of State's doing and how we can sort of help fill in the gaps there. So,
okay. Any questions, members? Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Chair calls up Ed Johnson.
Looks like he's gone.
Oh, Ed, he gave it up. All right. Does not wish to testify, and he is in favor of the bill. So we are down to the Secretary of State. Okay, Keith. Anybody has any questions?
I do.
Okay, come on down, Keith.
Good evening, Madam Chair and Committee. Keith Ingram here from the Secretary of State Elections Division.
Thank you for staying to the end.
On House Board Bill 2481.
Okay, Rev. Reynolds.
Thank you, Keith. I just had a few questions for clarification. Those mobile units that have been discussed today, those mobile units, they don't go to people's houses, do they?
No, but we would sure like to go to the high school where those girls go.
Okay.
We've gone to several high schools and had good success with that.
Now, are these facts or figures, stats correct that more than 80 counties in Texas lack a DPS facility to process identification card requests?
I'm probably not the best one to answer that. I remember in 2013 when we were talking about this, if the number was 71 or 79, so it's in that range, but I don't know the exact number.
Okay. And with respect to the study that I saw earlier that was conducted by the Arizona State University, are you familiar with that?
I am not.
Okay. And are the figures correct that there were more than 600,000 or 4.5% of registered voters in Texas that didn't have a photo ID?
I know that that's a number that's been discussed from the litigation. I know that it was a hotly contested number. I also know that on one version of that, what we call the no match list, I was on it twice, and my lovely wife was on it twice, and obviously we both have IDs.
So do you have any statistics that you can provide to me? to this
No,
committee?
the best we could do, and with all the problems inherent in matching two lists and data points on those lists, was what we had. But knowing that those people don't match to an ID doesn't mean that they don't have an ID. So it's the best number we've got, but it's not in any sense to be taken as these people don't have IDs. These people didn't match with an ID.
So just so we're clear for discussions today, with the data that we have currently, what would that number approximately? What would that number be?
I don't know. We haven't run the list since early in 2012.
Okay, so there's no stats on that.
No current information.
Do you think it would be helpful to do a study on it?
I don't know. I know that we had more voters turn out last election than we've ever had before, and I know that we had in the neighborhood of 16,000 reasonable impediment affidavits. And
I think 16,280 was the number.
It's 0.18% of voters who voted that way, which is some indication that, you know, if you've got the highest turnout that you've ever had and you've only got 16,000 reasonable impediment declarations, that's some evidence that the number is not 600,000 that don't have an ID.
We heard some testimony today that there could have, likely been, thousands of people that were discouraged and didn't vote, because of that. So we have no way to weigh that or know how many people that didn't vote.
That's
correct?
right. If they don't show up, we can't help them.
Because one of the things I've seen, and you would know this, is that Texas, I believe, had the highest or the lowest percentage of its eligible population to vote. Is that correct?
That I do not believe that is the case. We certainly were at the top, but I don't think we were the
Oh,
bottom.
I saw evidence that,
You
I
would
can
have
look
to
it
look
up,
at electproject.org
that we were near
and
the
look.
bottom. So I hope not, but that's what I saw. So thank you, Keith.
Thank you.
Well, Keith, how many people were registered? Didn't we have the highest number of people registering?
So we had 15.1 million people registered to vote going into the November election, which was a new record. And according to that electproject.org, we've got 17,300,000 or 400,000 eligible citizens. So
we came pretty close to getting everybody registered.
Pretty close. And here in Travis County, they had
100%.
Yeah, 94%,
Wow.
93.6% of their eligible voters registered. So, yeah, it was the most we've ever had registered, and we had the most voters that we've ever had turn
And
out.
I was going to say 8.9, something like that.
That's right,
Huge.
almost 9
And then, yeah, I saw a number 13.5, but correct me. It was 16
Yeah, the
that
Austin
filled
American
out the
Statesman-
impediment affidavit.
Yes, the Austin American Statesman has reported 16,400, and we believe that to be real close.
Okay. So, and it seemed to me the big confusion was that when the court order came out, that folks thought they didn't have to have any ID. That was the big confusion.
Yes.
It was.
And, but obviously, 8.9 million voted. I mean, even if somebody went up, they were either voted provisionally or through the impediment affidavit.
That's right.
And have you heard a lot of cases where folks said, no, you're not voting no matter what?
I don't know if that happened. I know that we get calls like that every election where somebody shows up to vote and the poll workers aren't giving them the option of a provisional ballot or are expecting more of the ID. That's another thing that I wanted to mention is that the affidavits, the reasonable impediment declaration and the forms of ID thereunder, as well as the forms of ID under 630101, the 7 acceptable forms of identification, the addresses on those never have to match. The purpose of those is not to confirm the address. And the way that you confirm the address is under 63002. The poll worker asks, do you still live at the voter registration address? Or some counties say, could you give me your address? And if it's the same as the voter registration address. So that's the way you check address. You don't check address by ID documents. Those are for ID only. Right. And one of the things that we had to really drill into the county's heads whenever they're training poll workers is the address on the driver's license doesn't have to match. I would make them repeat it with me at seminar.
And
the addresses
and y'all
don't
conduct
have
it.
to
Y'all
match.
do conduct those trainings for
Absolutely
every
we do.
county.
And that is a message that we have done our best to pound into counties so that they can tell their poll workers, because when you're dealing with 27,000 Texans across the state, it takes a while for them to get the message. And this process in House Bill 2481 is enough like the process. It's almost exactly the same as the process that we had in November. And so as we go forward with I agree with what the last witness said, that there was confusion because it changes all the time. So what we would ask as an elections community is let's keep it the same for a while. And
Right.
then let the poll
Let it-
workers get used to it, let the
let it
voters
play
get used
out,
to it.
right.
Whatever it is, just let us have the same thing for a while. And,
Right.
and I promise the uptake on the information will get better and better.
Yeah, I think people are getting, comfortable and used to, I need to have, a photo ID. And, when we did the impeachment, folks needed to understand you still have to have something. But even on that, you didn't have to have anything.
Right.
So, and that was still a very, very, very small
Percentage. Right, I agree
Yeah.
with that.
Any other questions?
Yeah,
Vice Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Keith, I'm going to back up just a little bit on registration, because I know that IDs are something that we've been talking about here. And to Rep. Fallon's point, if somebody is not a United States citizen, can they get registered to vote?
Conceivably, yes. They could lie on the application, and then if they've got, if they pass we've got what we call live check, but it doesn't check citizenship. It just says, do we have a last name and a date of birth that matches the ID number they gave? So if they've got a valid driver's license number or a valid last four of a social, and it matches their last name, and they've lied about being a citizen, then they will pass live check and they will become a registered voter.
So to get registered, you need to have either the driver's license or personal number, or you need the last four digits of your social.
Yes, that's from the Help America Vote Act in
Either or.
2002, the federal law.
And I'm sorry, Madam Chair, did you have a question?
Okay, I just wanted to follow up on what you just said.
Go
That
ahead.
If they check the citizen box, and there's by federal law, you're not allowed to verify that.
Right. Under the
So,
current
so
case law.
essentially, they could.
They can.
Mm-hmm. It could happen.
How many, with the last change that we've been through, how many complaints of voter fraud did you receive?
So, like the Attorney General said, 31006 of the Election Code says that we can't talk about any complaints that we refer over to the Attorney General. They're not public information until the Attorney General makes a decision on whether or not to prosecute or finishes their investigation. I can tell you how many complaints that we got that we didn't refer, but I don't think that number would help you much. We had, over 200 complaints that we received from the 2016 primary and general election that we did not refer over to the Attorney General.
So I take from that comment that you did receive complaints of fraud and you did refer some to the AG's office. We just can't talk about how many and get into the details of that right now.
Right, and the AG does have a spreadsheet of information that they're willing to disclose with that, with general information about the complaints that they've received from us.
To talk about the number?
The number and the nature of them, but just generally.
Well, and in that to protect the person, so that if it turns out to be nothing, you don't want somebody falsely accused.
You don't want that, and you don't want to compromise an investigation with
Well,
particulars,
that's it,
and so you
yeah.
don't want to do either one of those two things.
So the AG's office can tell us the number of referrals they have, but you can't?
Right.
Okay.
Because of
Can
the
we
way
ask them to just put that
31006
on the
is
record?
worded.
I'm sorry?
Because of the way 31006 of the election code is worded,
Okay.
I can read it to you. if you want.
Gotcha. No, thank you. I
You
trust you
wanna call it
completely.
back up?
Please, just
You
for a
wanna call
quick.
the AG back up?
Yes.
Okay. Members, are there any
Madam
other?
Chair, real
Yes,
quick.
Rep. Reynolds.
And Keith, I apologize. I looked it up. It was November, the midterm election in November 2014, where Texas had a voting turnout of 28.5% of the eligible voters, making it the worst in the country in November of 2014, not 16. So I stand corrected.
That one I would agree with you on.
Okay. Thank you.
That was a midterm.
Yeah, there's a midterm,
Yeah,
right.
okay. All right, members, any other questions?
No, ma'am.
Thanks, Keith. Okay, we have a request to call up the AG again. So, both of you have already, we're just going to do Brantley. Okay.
Brantley Starr, Attorney General's office, here as a resource witness on HB 2481 and not any other bill.
Thank you. All right. Vice Chair.
So, Mr. Starr, how many cases were referred by the Secretary of State's office to the Attorney General?
I don't know that information
voter
off the
fraud.
top of my head. We can get that information for you.
When?
Well, we have
Tomorrow?
elections group that we can pull together. I'm not sure what form you're wanting the information in, so I'm not sure.
I'm just looking for a number. You said there's a spreadsheet that exists.
I don't keep it, so I'll
Who
go
keeps
find.
it?
Our prosecutors keep it. I'm assuming they
I
keep
thought you
it.
only had 2 people.
That's
who do
correct.
this.
We have prosecutors who work on white collar crime.
Okay. Then I would like to know how many complaints the state has received and how many were referred to you. If you could get that to us as quickly as possible.
That we can do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions, members?
Was it bigger than a bread box?
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that is all the testimony that signed up. Is there anyone else that wishes to speak on, for, or against House Bill Committee Substitute, House Bill 2481? And seeing none, I just want to thank y'all. This is a very, important issue, and I just appreciate everybody staying late and all the questions. So thank y'all.
I have a question,
Yeah.
Madam Chair. The author of the bill, unfortunately, was unable to be here tonight.
Yes.
Will he be available next week? Do you know? So
I
we
hope
can ask
so.
questions.
Yeah, we told him to stay home this week.
Yeah.
Recover. He's only really got 3 days, 3.5 days. So
I'm
take your time, get well, and yeah, he'll be here.
For next Monday's hearing.
We hope.
Okay.
We want him well.
Okay.
He was
Thank you.
pretty sick. Yeah. So, having said that, the chair withdraws the substitute to House Bill 2481, and House Bill 2481 will be left pending at this time. Oh, pardon me. Thank you very much. Okay, yes. I am closing. Let me reopen that. I'm going to open it back up. Okay, I'm opening it back up, laying out the substitute for House Bill 2481, and I close. You got me distracted here. And now I withdraw the substitute for House Bill 2481, and we'll leave it pending. I withdraw the substitute for House Bill 2481, and I will leave it pending at this time. Thank y'all for staying. Thank you. And
Thank you.
there being no other business, the Committee on Elections will stand adjourned and subject to the call of the chair. Thank y'all.